So good morning, everybody. Welcome to KAPSARC, World Energy Council, and the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies workshop on the circular carbon economy. It's great to see everybody in person. It's good to be back having our workshops in person after almost 2 years of virtual webinars. And I would like to also welcome those who couldn't join us today and signing up virtually. Hopefully we will have an opportunity to meet soon. Today's workshop, as mentioned, will talk about the circular carbon economy, the 4 R's: the reduce, reuse, recycle, and remove. And in particular, the framework for circular carbon economy was endorsed by the G20 last year, and as well as this year communique. We are now trying to implement or find ways that can utilize the circular carbon economy framework to achieve net zero emission world using this framework. This workshop is hosted by King Abdullah Petroleum Studies and Research Center in collaboration with the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies and the World Energy Council. And it is our great pleasure to join forces with our colleagues in the center as well as in the council on this very important topic. The goal of the workshop is to understand how the circular carbon economy framework can help us achieve the Paris agreements and the net zero emission world, and the key challenges and enablers. Through 3 main sessions, we will be discussing pathways to net zero emission that incorporate all options as articulated in the circular carbon economy. We're pleased to launch today the Circular Carbon Economy Index, which is KAPSARC's attempt to measure this performance as well as the enablers in different countries using the circular carbon economy approach. We will be also launching a web portal that shows the methodology of the circular carbon economy index, as well as the ranking and scores of different countries. We covered around 30 countries, the G20 countries, plus 10 more countries. Then we will be hearing about the key enablers of the CCE framework and how the CCE concept can be particularly enabled and implemented, and the role of various technologies, including hydrogen and the carbon capture and storage. That will be in the last session. At this point, I would like to take this opportunity to thank in advance all the speakers and the panelists for their contribution. And I just want to mention one last thing. If you notice on your name tag, there is an Arabic writing under it, and that's your first name. And this is to celebrate the year of Arabic calligraphy, which is the 2021. So we thought about showing how the first name is written in Arabic. So thank you all. I look forward for the discussion. The webinar will be recorded, but it will be recorded for the purpose of our research. I would, unfortunately, I have to leave for my flight later in the morning, but I'm sure the discussion will be very rich. I would like to pass the mic to our co-host, the world, Chris Gentle, the senior advisor at the World Energy Council. Chris, the mic is yours.
Thank you very much, Ahad. Good morning, everybody. Delighted to be here, and I hope everybody's having a successful meeting at COP so far. Let me tell you a little bit about the World Energy Council, and we're very proud to partner with KAPSARC, and not just today, but on an ongoing basis. The World Energy Council will be next year 100 years old, and was formed actually by a Scotsman, Mr. Dunlop, which is quite appropriate given where we are in Glasgow at the present time. So our 100-year anniversary is that we are an organization that basically spans the whole of the energy ecosystem. So from coal, oil and gas, right through to hydro, and renewables and nuclear as well. So an organization that is not for profit, that basically is on a global basis. So we have 90 countries around the world that have member committees for the World Energy Council, and very much engaged in the energy transition at the present time. Our focus is humanizing energy. And we're really focused on a clean and just transition, and bringing together all of that energy ecosystem to make that work. So very much looking forward to the focus today in terms of the circular carbon economy, because we see that as a very, very important part of this clean and just energy transition. And just to bring that to life a little bit more, what does that mean for us? One thing is basically in terms of data. So yes, IEA produces fantastic data. We know that in terms of what's happening in terms of generation and reserves. But we want to focus more on the demand, because we think in terms of energy generation, we need to engage more people, not energy people, but all people in terms of that energy transition. So having data is an absolute critical part of that. The skills transition is very, very important. So what skills are required for the circular carbon economy, and hydrogen, as my colleague Paul will speak about shortly. What about literacy? So the world took 200 years to go from 10% to 90% of literacy in the world, in general literacy. Now, in terms of energy literacy, our estimate that we're below maybe 5% of the population understanding what happens around energy transition. So we need to rapidly up that in terms of literacy around the world, in terms of understanding what that means in terms of energy transition, and really engage people. So that humanizing energy. And finally, in terms of that engagement, really around things like a circular carbon economy being absolutely pivotal in terms of that shift that happens. We talk about energy transitions and transformations, not just one, but many. And I think that's fantastic today to actually have that focus from KAPSARC and the new index in order to kind of bring some clarity and some insights to that. So delighted to be here and looking forward to the debate this morning. Thank you.
Good morning to all. My name is James Henderson. I'm Director of the Energy Transition Research at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. We're an academic think tank, obviously based in Oxford, focused on energy, oil, gas, renewables, a little bit of coal as well, but now primarily as well on the energy transition. So it's a pleasure for us to partner with KAPSARC and the World Energy Council for a discussion on the important topic that we're addressing today. As an institute, we're certainly keen to explore all the options to achieve the world's energy transition goals, and we certainly think the circular carbon economy provides an interesting framework to explore the various potential pathways to achieving net zero, and so we're really looking forward to the event today. I'm going to be moderating the three sessions. The slide you can see, hopefully, outlines those sessions. So between now and 10:15 UK time, we're going to be discussing global circular carbon economy scenarios. And a little bit more on detail on that in a second. Then we'll have a short break, and then between 10:30 and 11:30, we'll be discussing two indices that aim to provide metrics for the circular carbon economy. Fahad's already mentioned the Circular Carbon Economy Index, which is being launched or is being launched at COP26 by KAPSARC. And we'll also talk about the World Energy Trilemma Index from the World Energy Council. We'll then have an hour's break or so and come back to discuss some of the key enablers of the circular carbon economy concept. We'll focus on technological, financial, and political issues and look specifically at carbon capture and storage, biogas, hydrogen, and energy efficiency. So I should say we're very keen to have interaction from both our live audience, and we have an audience around a table here in Glasgow, but also from our very large virtual audience as well. There's more than 300 people registered for this event. So just as a point of admin for those in the room, if you want to make a statement, if I could just ask you in the traditional fashion to use your name tag and perhaps put it vertical and to let me know you want to say something. And if you're online, then please do use the Q&A box. I'm sure you're very familiar with Zoom these days. So just use the Q&A box. I've got the Q&A box open in front of me, and we'll be very happy to read any comments or questions that you have and put them to the speakers and the discussants. If I can have the next slide, please. So let's move on to session one, where we're going to discuss, as I say, scenarios towards a net zero world, incorporating the circular carbon economy concept. We have, and this will be the format for all the sessions, we have a couple of speakers to introduce the main themes, and then we have some discussants who are going to basically reflect on what they've heard, perhaps introduce a few ideas and issues of their own. We'll have a short discussion amongst the speakers and the discussants, and then we'll get the rest of the audience involved, both live and virtually, and hopefully fill an hour with a fascinating discussion. So I'm very happy to welcome as speakers this morning, Mohammed Hijazi from KAPSARC and Yoshikazu Kobayashi from the IEEJ in Japan, and he's speaking to us live from Tokyo. And then as discussants, we have Jonathan Stern from OIES, Vaibhav Chaturvedi from CEEW in India, and Paul Appleby, who's with us virtually from the World Energy Council. So without further ado, let us get into the meat of the discussion. And let me introduce Mohammed, who's going to make the first presentation.
Thank you very much, James. It's a pleasure to present to you guys on our work. If you can move to the next slide, please. It's my pleasure to introduce the work we've been doing at KAPSARC, looking at global circular carbon economy scenarios that would be in line with the Paris Agreement and in line with achieving net zero target. I'd like to acknowledge my colleague, Fadil Swena from KAPSARC, who's also contributed to this work. Next slide, please. So I thought I would start off by explaining what we mean by the circular carbon economy. It's a framework that allows to manage and minimize the leakage of CO2 and other greenhouse gases to the atmosphere through different types of technologies, all types of technologies that are available. And it builds very nicely on the concept of the circular economy. So it's which has been around for a while, and it has taken us from the linear economy concept of produce and waste to produce and then reuse and recycle. The circular carbon economy adds another element called remove, which is removing the CO2 from the atmosphere and either using it in productive mode or to store it underground. If you go next slide or one click so I can get the animation. So in the carbon context, the idea of the circular carbon economy is to move us from the linear carbon economy where we produce, combust, and then leak the CO2 to the atmosphere, which then causes the global warming effect, to combust and then capture that CO2 and then reuse it and recycle it to the extent possible. And in some cases, we would have to remove it through the various technologies like direct air capture, carbon storage, capture and storage, or nature-based solutions. So that's in a nutshell what we're referring to over here. Next slide, please. So in our analysis, we've looked at 4 types of scenarios to get us on looking at what I call a reference scenario or a no policy scenario, assuming there are no climate policies. And this is more of a benchmark to get a sense of where we would be landing, how much more emissions we would anticipate into the future, given the population growth and income growth and things of that nature. And then the green line is a representation if we were to account for all the pledges that have been done, made in terms of updating indices and net zero targets. What we find is that we are not, we won't be able to achieve the Paris Agreement. So we're in shortage of getting to below 2 degrees. And the last two lines, the last two scenarios are scenarios that would be in line with the Paris Agreement. So it gives you a sense of how much more we need to reduce our emissions. And here we're looking at all greenhouse gases, not just CO2. The blue line is looking at a net zero pathway, and here net zero of carbon dioxide specifically, right? So it doesn't go to net zero for all greenhouses gases, but it's net zero for CO2, and it's below 2 degrees. Red line is net zero by 2050 of CO2 emissions, and with some overshoot, but we get down to 1.5 world. So I'll dive into the two scenarios at the bottom of to be more in line with the Paris Agreement and utilize the CCE framework. But really the message on this slide is that current pledges will not be enough to get us to achieve the Paris Agreement. Next slide. Next slide, please. So this is a deep dive into one of the scenarios, the scenario that was looking at achieving a net zero by 2075 and be within 2 degrees of warming. And what we find, so the way to interpret this figure, on the y-axis, we're looking at global emissions, and the far left bar is what the emissions out of 2015. The next one is the additional emissions we would have added with no mitigation. And then the next colored bars are indicating where the savings would come from, how we're going to shave off these emissions across different technologies. And what you immediately see, and again, the last bar is showing how much GHGs we would have. So in this scenario design, we actually get net zero for CO2, but we still have some other non-CO2s in the system. But this is just indicating that we would need to utilize all tools in the mix to achieve that target, right? So we're looking at energy efficiency, renewables, fuel switching, electrification, non-CO2s, and removal technologies. And you really need to have all these technologies available to be able to achieve this target. Next slide, please. But this won't be an easy one. So, we said we're not in line with the Paris Agreement. We think it's doable. The 1.5 world is not out of reach yet. It's going to be challenging though. And this is just a few examples of why we think it's quite challenging. Because again, we're talking about still a massive increase in energy consumption over the coming few decades, and a massive shift. I mean, Chris was talking about how long it took us to move from 10% to 90% over 200 years. And now we're talking about a massive shift from 85, or so of being fossil-based energy to less than 50% over the next 30, 50 years. So it's quite a challenge to do that. And if we're talking about massive electrification across all the end-use sectors, where we're looking at increasing from almost by fourfold, from roughly about 87 exajoules to about 400 exajoules. It's a massive increase in electrification and in electricity supply, especially in renewables. So our estimates of how much investment we're looking at in wind and solar, for instance, we're looking at if, so the record addition we've seen in 2020, according to IRENA, was in the order of, I think 238 gigawatt of additional solar and wind. So in our estimates, we're saying we need to increase that by 60% and sustain that over the next 50 years. So massive, massive investments that we're talking about. So again, it's doable, but it will be challenging for sure. Next slide, please. Now, over the next few slides, I want to cover a different element of our analysis, and that is if you were to account for all tools within your toolbox, which again is in line with the circular carbon economy, versus if you have little faith in removal technologies in particular and say, okay, we have to give up on it and just focus on the other elements. What we find, and similar to what was found previously through IPCC reports and others, is that the cost of mitigation is going to increase substantially without removal technologies. And our estimates put it somewhere between 21 and 94%, which amounts to roughly about an additional loss of 2 to 2.6% of global GDP. Again, massive increase. It would cost the world much more if we don't have the removal technologies to use when we need them. Next slide, please. And also we would have, as I mentioned, we would have to invest heavily in the electricity sector, but we would increase it even further. So we're looking at an additional 15% increase in electricity investment in the next few decades if we don't allow for the removal technologies. The other dimension or the other side of the coin to worry about is stranded assets. And what I mean by stranded assets here, these are power plants that are prematurely retired before the end of their lifetime. And as such, they cost quite a bit to their economies. And we're looking at an increase of 25% of an increase in stranded assets in the power sector if we don't allow for the remote technologies to come to play. Next slide, please. The third dimension we looked at is revenues from fossil resources, and we've estimated that that would decrease by an additional 20% without the removal technologies. And our initial estimate is that we would leave roughly about 73% of all known resources of fossil resources underground. That would increase to 83% under a no CCS scenario. So again, just another dimension to keep to look at. Next slide, please. So I've talked about so far that we're not in line with the Paris Agreement, but we think it's still doable. And we think it's going to be challenging and it's going to cost us more if we don't account for removal technologies. The other dimension we've looked at is the equity issue. And what we find is, and here equity, I mean how the cost of the impacts are distributed across different nations in a per capita notion. And what we find is that by allowing all regions to play to their own strength and allowing for all technologies to be available, we end up with more equitable solutions in terms of how the costs are distributed across different nations, and in terms of mitigation costs and in terms of the losses and revenues in hydrocarbons. Next slide, and that'll take me to my next slide. So 4 key messages that I'd like to leave you with. One is that, again, current pledges are insufficient to meet the Paris Agreement, and we need to increase our ambition over the next decades. The CCE scenarios show that the Paris Agreement is still within reach, but will require massive investment, as shown. And third, scenarios that are in line with the CCE framework, with the circular carbon economy, we find that they are cheaper and more equitable. And last but not least, climate change is a global problem that requires a global solution and requires all actors, all sectors, all technologies to play a role. So we really need to embrace a more holistic approach to this problem, which is, again, at the heart of the circular carbon economy approach. With that, I'll pass it back to you, James. Thank you.
Thanks, Mohammed. That was really interesting and lots of detail to dive into. We're starting to get some questions coming in online already, so that's great. Do keep them coming, and we'll get to those once we've got through the next presentation and the discussions. So, and it's my pleasure now to introduce Yoshikazu Kobayashi from IEEJ, who I think is going to is now sharing his slides. Ideal. So we'll just wait for him to get into presentation mode.
Yeah.
And then Yoshi, I will hand over to you for your presentation.
Yes. Let me see. Okay. Can you see the full screen?
Yep, it's all looking good and we can hear you very well.
Okay, great. Thank you for your kind introduction, Dr. Henderson. My name is Yoshikazu Kobayashi of the Institute of Energy Economics, Japan. I'm very pleased to speak about our latest outlook with a focus on our own circular carbon economy scenario today. Okay. We annually publish our own long-term energy outlook called IEEJ Outlook. It is a study to quantify the future global energy supply and demand until 2050. The outlook is provided with a forecast approach instead of a backcast approach like the IEA's net zero scenario. So I like you to note that we do not have net zero emission scenario as of 2050 in our outlook. In the outlook, we conducted multiple scenario analysis on progress and trends in technologies and policies. In the outlook, we provided 3 different scenarios: reference case, advanced technology case, and circular carbon economy scenario case. The third one is a major topic of this presentation. This is a scenario based on the concept of circular carbon economy with 4R technologies. The scenario reflects not only the assumptions of aggressive adoption of conventional green technologies like energy conservation, renewable energy, and nuclear, but also of the maximum introduction of technologies to decarbonize the use of fossil fuels. Just briefly, I'd like to share with our own interpretation of circular carbon economy concept. I know this is a little bit different from that of KAPSARC, but we still think this is more clear-cut to understand the different phases of 4Rs. In our interpretation, reduce is by far the most important step by reducing the amount of carbon entering the system by renewables. But realistically, we believe that we will have an unabated carbon emission in the system, which in our interpretation are the phases of reuse and recycles. We will utilize those unabated carbons either with chemical conversion or without chemical conversions. But we will still have residual carbons. Then we will adopt the remove technologies to completely eliminate the carbon emissions in the future. So these are our interpretation of 4R technologies. And then we assume different type of decarbonization technology of fossil fuels in each of 4R steps. Please note that this does not include a conventional decarbonization technology like renewable or nuclear or biomass. Because of the time constraint, I wouldn't go into detail of each of the technology assumptions today, but this material can be downloaded from our website. So for those, if you have any interest in our assumptions, please access to our institute website. Okay, this is our forecast of total primary energy demand as of 2050 in advanced technology case and circular carbon economy case. Advanced technology case is a scenario we assume aggressive adoption of conventional green technologies like renewables and energy conservation and nuclear. And in circular carbon economy, we assumed additional adoption of the technologies to decarbonize the use of fossil fuels. As you see, the total consumption volume of fossil fuel does not change between advanced technology case and circular carbon economy case. But if you look at the carbon emissions, we assumed that in the circular carbon economy case, we can achieve 6 gigaton additional carbon emission reductions, although the total amount of consumption of fossil fuel has not changed very much. This is because we assumed significant adoption of hydrogen in the various sectors of energy consumptions. So if you look at the left-hand graph again, and you see that the natural gas demand increased from advanced technology case to circular carbon economy case, because this incremental natural gas demand is used for the hydrogen production. And one other important thing is that in the circular carbon economy, if you look at the breakdown of reduced carbon emissions from advanced technology case to circular carbon economy case, we expect that the carbon emissions in non-power sector is larger in circular carbon economy because hydrogen is effectively utilized to decarbonize the non-power sector in the circular carbon economy scenario. I will talk a little bit more in detail about this issue in following slides. This is a very how can I say? I wouldn't, maybe I don't need to explain very much about this decarbonization in power sector. As you see, we expect more zero emission power generation sources, both in advanced economies and developing economies. But it is relatively easy to electrify in, easy to decarbonize the electricity sector. But that is not really the case in a non-power sector. In long distance transportation sector or heavy industry sector, both of which are often called as hard to abate sector. It is not easy to decarbonize in those sectors because of the difficulty to electrify. So we need to think about how to decarbonize these non-power sectors. And we believe hydrogen will play a very important role to decarbonize such non-power sectors. This is our assumptions of the hydrogen demand in different sectors. We expect that hydrogen will play a very important role in power generations, and particularly thanks to the technological breakthrough to directly utilize ammonia into the boiler. So we expect that ammonia will play a very important role to decarbonize the power generation sector. And what is more important is the non-power sector, as I mentioned. We think hydrogen will be extensively utilized in building sectors and transportation sectors. And also, we think blue hydrogen will play a larger role than green hydrogen because of the cost competitiveness and production capacity. And also, we think synthetic methane and synthetic fuel will also play an important role in to decarbonize those hard to abate sectors. Finally, I'd like to touch upon the disparity issue between developed countries and developing countries, as this is one of the major topics in our latest outlook. As all of us know that there are wide disparity in terms of GDP per capita or energy demand per capita between developed and developing countries. So we analyzed what will be the economic burden for ASEAN countries, for instance, when they achieve carbon neutrality by 2050 or 2060. This is a result of analysis. We think, based on this, not really think, based on the analysis, we found that more than 2% of their annual GDP will be needed to achieve the carbon neutrality in ASEAN countries. And their power prices will triple from the current level if they achieve carbon neutrality as of 2060. So this figure shows that achieving carbon neutrality within a short period of time, like 2050 or 2060, may cause significant economic burden on developing countries like ASEAN. This is just to restate what I've said, so maybe I will stop here. Thank you for your attention.
Yoshi, thank you very much indeed. You raised some fascinating issues, and questions are coming in already on a number of the topics you have raised. So thank you to you, and thank you also people for asking questions already. We'll come to them shortly. So we've got three discussants who are going to discuss their thoughts on what we've heard so far. I'm going to turn to Vaibhav Chaturvedi from CEEW in India first. Vaibhav, some thoughts and perhaps sort of how relevant this all is to India as well.
Great. Thank you, James, and thank you for the organizer for inviting me here. It's a very interesting discussion. And Mohammed and Yoshi have really set the context, and some very important points have been made. The first is about, I think, the policy being technology agnostic. And that is very interesting, very important point, because we do see it is not necessarily so. across many countries of the world. For example, especially nuclear technology, we know the German position on nuclear technology, right? So it is not necessary always that in reality countries are technology agnostic. And in this context, in the CCS debate, I just want to, touch about two big points. What is the, first of all, government positions? What drives government position? And I think that it's the larger country context which always drives the government positions. What is really happening in India? But I think the generic point is clear all across. It is the government positions that do matter on technologies, and the positions are not always sort of official positions. They could also be unofficial positions. And that is very interesting. For example, the German government has a very official position against nuclear energy. In India, there's no official position against any technology. But if you go, we meet very often the government, representatives and all. In any of the modeling scenarios, whenever we have CCS out in there, unofficially, it is always like the scenario that is always sidelined. And that is the reality. So the question is for us to understand that what is the larger country context that kind of drives these government positions in many, many countries. And I'll talk about India specifically. And I think something very critical for a developing economy is the notion of affordability, right? And this, very interestingly, this whole point about affordability being a very important pillar of the energy policy of India that drives really these just choices of technology, these unofficial positions behind these technologies. So affordability is critical because the way CCS is viewed is that it is an add-on to the cost. That is how it is viewed. It's a cost add-on, and the power prices are absolutely critical for a developing economy. And whenever this CCS is kind of pitted against new emerging technologies like solar and battery and the falling cost of solar and battery, it always appears that it is going to be much more expensive as compared to these other alternatives that governments are available. And that drives a lot of these, especially in India, the government position, unofficial position, as I've been saying, against, this technology. So the larger, in the context of a particular country, these country-specific factors do matter. In India's affordability, in some other countries, it might be, some other factors. The question for us is, what would change this context? Would there be anything that changes this context that would end up changing this sort of unofficial position of the government, right? And so within India, at least, what we are finding now, the one is the policy position about decarbonization. That is going to be one critical driver of the context. The second is this, rising incomes, and income growth is going to be absolutely critical for changing the larger context and also changing the positions of the government. So the recent net zero announcement, a lot of us might have heard about it. That does change the context. And I do believe that in future, that's going to be a very strong driver of this changing context. So why this announcement matters is, for the first time, India has changed from its earlier positions of decarbonization, which were around sort of percentage or emission intensity kind of targets, to absolute mitigation targets. And that is absolutely important to emphasize. So because CCS within a emission intensity kind of target, it never made sense for them. It never made sense. The moment you change it to sort of hard absolute mitigation cuts, in fact, even in the 2030 targets, the Prime Minister highlighted about this 1 billion tons of CO2 and some absolute numbers of renewable energy. That has never happened. Till date, all the announcements by India have always been emission intensity of GDP or a percentage of non-fossil or renewable energy. It has never been absolute numbers. First time they've put absolute numbers on the table. That does change the game. So that is one thing. The second thing is about rising incomes, and current Indian per capita income is around $2,000 per capita, right? And of course, the developed world incomes are much higher, probably around $50,000 per capita. Yeah? So of course, we do see the difference is like humongous difference, no doubt about it, right? And this country context drives this whole point about affordability of energy being the most important pillar of energy policy, right? Affordability, because the incomes are so low. But even on an average growth rates of like 5.5% per annum on an average for next 30 years, which is very realistic, we do think around 2055 or 60, the incomes would be around $13,000-14,000 per capita. Chinese current incomes are around $10,000 per capita. So we are talking about a much richer India. So even in the cost of energy that Yoshi identified is a very important part of the debate as of now. But with just the natural process of growth, it is not just about the cost of energy, it is the affordability as a metric that matters. Affordability is going to improve, very significantly. right? So now these two drivers, that policy has become from, shifted from a sort of emission intensity kind of targets to absolute mitigation and rising incomes in the future, they are going to change the context of the country in a very, very significant way. And that is where I do see, the CCS debate in India going to be becoming much more positive. In fact, a very recent assessment that we did for India, specifically on CCS, how the sort of, how the perceptions of different government agencies as well as the private sector is changing from the CCS perspective. Very interesting findings. In the 15 years back, there was actually no government document that, and if there was any document that barely mentioned, gave a lip service to CCS. Now, increasingly, we are seeing the Department of Science and Technology investing or funding research for many of the technical institutes in kind of physics kind of research, chemistry and physics research for CCS. India is a part of Mission Innovation, in which CCS is a part. So they're also thinking about some pilots. In fact, some of the private companies, very interestingly, the cement companies. So after the brief was released, a couple of big cement companies reached out to us because they already have their net zero commitments. Within the net zero commitments, they've already stated CCS as a part of it, because for the cement companies, it's very difficult. There is no electrification, or hydrogen doesn't work for them. So they're clearly very interested. And very interestingly, a very big public sector undertaking, which is BHEL, which is Bharat Heavy Electrical Limited. Essentially, they're a manufacturing company. They manufacture boilers and all that. But it's a public sector undertaking. They also reached out to us because they are seeing CCS and this manufacturing of the components as a big business opportunity, right? And these are the things. The moment if I start telling the government of India that, well, solar is a big manufacturing opportunity, and that is the reality why the government has been pushing so hard on solar, the moment they start viewing CCS also as a big sort of manufacturing opportunity and an export opportunity, that changes the game. So the question is about how does the context changes? Some things will automatically happen. Well, it is the natural process of growth. The net zero target is a policy choice which has been made, and this whole narrative around could CCS provide a fillip to manufacturing and jobs in India, those are going to be game-changing things for at least Indian context. But I think the generic lessons for all the countries is about how technologies are placed within their own national context, that if we understand that better, I think we'll have a much better sense of the future of many of these technologies. Yes, thank you.
Thanks very much, Vibram. Thank you for raising the affordability question. I think that's certainly one we need to talk about in the Q&A, and it has been raised, and the sort of different technologies and their comparisons been raised in the online audience already. Let me turn to Jonathan Stern from OIS for some comments, and I think probably some discussion about methane emissions as well. But Jonathan, over to you.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. I found this extremely interesting at the circular carbon economy discussion. I guess what I would say, though, is that in comparison with the discourse that we're having in Europe, this all seems very long term. I mean, I picked up from the presentations, talk about 2075, talking about COP21 Paris targets. In Europe, the discussion is about not just net zero by 2050, but actually getting started and seriously by 2030 in reducing emissions. And this may be a very European-centric view, but I think it's important to inject that if you look at the IEA World Energy Outlook, it makes it very clear that if we haven't made significant progress by 2030, we have no chance of achieving these net zero targets by 2050. And so what we have in Europe is governments under pressure. Governments have actually got to deliver near-term emission reductions, and they may be under voter pressure to do that. So when I hear people and these interesting presentations looking at hydrogen and CCS and how long these technologies will take to bring into at scale, I wonder whether this is going to be fast enough to meet the expectations of at least the European community that we listen to in this part of the world. I mean, I don't know if any of you managed to look at the Oxford Energy Forum Energy Transition document that Jim Henderson edited. There's an article in there on capture technologies that people have been talking about here by a British academic who pretty much dismissed them on the basis that, look how little progress they've made in the last 20 years. Why are we relying on them for the next 20 years? I'm not saying I endorse that opinion. What will come out of this COP as a major achievement is the Global Methane Pledge, now signed by apparently 109 countries. Every time I look at their site, a few more countries have been added. And the great thing about the Global Methane Pledge and the potential for methane emissions, and this is endorsed by the CCAC, by the IEA, by global organizations that have really looked at this in detail, is this is something that can make a relatively large and immediate contribution to reducing the increase in global temperatures. And also it can do that because these are relatively simple, relatively low cost and some negative cost efforts that can be made, and it can be done relatively quickly. Now, there is a focus on oil and gas, and I know a lot of people say, well, what about agriculture? What about waste? What about coal? But the fact is that oil and gas can achieve these reductions much quicker and at lower cost than almost any other methane emitting sectors. And what I would say is that if the oil and gas sectors fail to deliver significant short-term methane reductions, their credibility is going to be seriously damaged. The key thing is this: we're not talking about very complex technologies. Now, we're not talking about building carbon capture and storage or large-scale direct air capture. We're simply talking about closing off leaks, operating more efficiently, kind of things that actually should be happening anyway. So I would just draw your attention to that in our discussion in terms of what can be achieved quickly and actually improve the credibility of fossil fuel industries in the eyes of environmentalists and NGOs. Thank you, Jim. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Jonathan. Again, some very important issues raised, and hopefully will inspire some questions. So before I turn to Paul Appleby from the World Energy Council for us, his thoughts, let me encourage people in the room to think about making some comments as well. Remember, just stick your name tag vertical and I'll know you want to say something. The online audience are participating. Please do continue to do that. But in the room, it would be nice to have some comments as well. But just before we go to Q&A, Paul, let me come to you and your kind of thoughts on what you've heard so far and any issues you want to raise.
Yeah, thank you, James. And I'm just sorry I can't be with you in person. And I'll try and be brief because I can see there's lots of good questions coming in already. I'm sure people in the room want to get into the discussion. I think there's a danger we're going to be in violent agreement on some of these issues. We, like everyone else, want to be technology impartial or technology agnostic. We seek the best mix of technology for people and planet. And if you rule out certain technologies, that obviously hampers you right from the start. I'll get a couple of observations on the scenarios that we've seen and try and put them in the context of other scenarios that are out there. The main issue clearly is the relative contribution of removal technologies or CCUS. If you compare what we've seen from KAPSARC and IEA here with, say, the IEA and others, with these CCE type scenarios, you're seeing more fossil fuel being used, balanced by more removal or more CCUS. Give you a rough scale, I think in the KAPSARC presentation I saw about 10 gigatons of removals, DACs and BECs, etc. The IEA's net zero 2050 scenario has about 2 gigatons. So we're in a ballpark quite a significantly higher level of contribution from those types of technologies. There's quite a compelling case there been made that if you don't have these removal technologies in the mix, you're going to have a higher cost. The ballpark estimate looks about right. I think what would be really helpful, a bit more transparency on that, if we could dig into, at the margin, what are those technologies displacing? So if there's more removal in the mix, if there's more CCUS and hydrogen in the mix, what is not in the mix? So it'll be more solar or wind, nuclear. How do those cost, how does that cost equation work? What are the cost assumptions for the technologies? and what difference in the assumptions would be required to reverse the conclusion. So how robust, if you like, is the lower cost of the CCE scenario conclusion? I'm an economist, so you won't be surprised to hear that obviously the ideal solution would be a global carbon price of some form. Can we put some of this into carbon price language? What kind of carbon price do you need to incentivize the CCE scenarios, the carbon removal scenarios in particular? What kind of carbon price? And is carbon price enough? If there was a carbon price that made things work in 2050, 2075, is that on its own enough, or do we need some early stage support policies to get the technologies going? We've there's a question about 1.5 degrees scenario. Neither of the presentations gave us a 1.5 degree CCE scenario. I presume it's possible, just would like to raise that as a question. Can you extend your scenarios to reach 1.5 with CCE? Is that feasible? And I absolutely agree with the point about timing and the need for near-term action. And there's a path dependency issue here as well. We need to get to 2030 with scalable options in place for the CCE economy. If they're not, then I think it's probably game over. So what needs to happen in the next even 5 years to demonstrate at scale that these kind of options really are there and can be available for the world to use beyond 2030? I'll stop there because I'm really keen to hear all the other questions that are circulating online and in the room.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Paul. And you've highlighted a lot of issues that we want to get into, and I'm going to come to you, Mohammed, almost immediately anyway. I think we should get into this timing issue. One of the things I wrote down straight away as I was watching your presentation was that you're focused on 2070 or 2075. And I think we should get into that point that Jonathan and Paul and others have raised, also Vaibhav, around the availability of the technologies and what you've assumed in creating your scenarios around CCUS and those technologies being available in the short term to get shorter term targets sort of met rather than the 50 years from now kind of goal. Your thoughts on that?
Thanks, James, and thanks for all the comments made earlier. There's a lot to respond to here, but I'll probably focus on the point that you raised, James, over here. So in our analysis, we've looked at both 2050 and 2075. For just the sake of time, we focus on the 2075. In 2050, we can also achieve the Paris Agreement and hit net zero by 2050 using the circular carbon economy approach. And I totally agree with the notion that we need to do a lot. And I think what the beauty about the circular carbon economy concept is that you want to be using all technologies available, and some technologies you're going to put in place immediately because they make all the economic sense in the world. Yeah, so to me, methane reduction is a low-hanging fruit that we all should be doing. Moving to investing in renewables is a low-hanging fruit that we all should be doing. But there is a limit to what these solutions can offer us. So there are the hard-to-abate sectors that we need to address. We don't have long-distance flights and shipping and steel and many other hard-to-abate sectors where we're going to have a hard time to abate the mitigation over there. So we need to invest in those technologies. So even in our scenarios, these tend to come more online, more toward the end. I know, Paul, you mentioned 10 gigaton versus 2. We were looking at 2075, and a lot of that CCS tends to come later on in the simulation rather than early on. But the rest we run, I think there is also the rest of playing favorites or giving up on certain technologies. Yes, certain countries have to play to their own strength and what makes sense in their own context. But I think there is a moral responsibility, especially on, it's always common, but differentiated responsibility. And there is a moral responsibility on nations that have the know-how that they need to invest in these technologies so they can drive down the cost. And CCS is a good example where we need to keep at it. And we need to move up the ambition from doing different pilot regions in certain regions to doing hubs and kind of doing it around, trying to drive the cost down to the extent possible, do it in a few regions, in a few geographies. And I think there is responsibility. Again, I would differentiate between developed nations and developing nations in that regard, that we have the moral responsibility of pushing these technologies. So they are available to drive, to deal with the issue of affordability that was raised by my colleague, Vipop. So I think we're seeing the same thing in the sense that we, the CCA framework is actually arguing for all these to be happening, but we should not give up on certain technologies now, because I think that's going to cost us all much more down the road.
Okay, thanks for that. Yoshi, let me come to you, because there's been some questions around this technology issue again, and you highlighted the fact that there are power generation is relatively easy to decarbonize, but there's some much harder sectors. And there's a question here around heavy emitter companies, industrial companies being relatively nervous about investing in these new technologies until they see them being proven. What assumptions are you making, and what are your thoughts on the hard to abate sectors and the key issues that need to be addressed there?
Thank you for a very important question. And actually, that is one of the key topics in Japanese government policy making circle. And I think, there are several discussions about whether we should adopt the carbon pricing or regulation to limit the absolute amount, or maybe control the intensity of carbon intensity of energy use in each industrial sector. What in my understanding, our government is trying to do is that they demand, they request, I would say, each industry to develop their own roadmap based on their available technologies or their ongoing R&D efforts in each of the processes they're working on. And I think that is the currently what the our government is doing. So, imposing very high carbon pricing may be one option, but we need to approach this option very carefully. Otherwise, that may significantly harm the our economy in total. So just requiring each industry to develop their own roadmap to reduce carbon emission, that may be the realistic way to pursue carbon neutrality.
Okay, thank you. There's a couple of comments in the room, so I'm going to turn to them first. Anupama Sen from OIES has got her name tag up. So Anupama, what would you like to say?
Yeah, thanks very much. Really interesting discussions. I guess I had more of a reflection than a question as such. And sort of on this discussion around what are removal technologies displacing at the margin, and where do they fit exactly, particularly for developing countries. And I sort of wanted to touch upon energy efficiency within that. I was quite interested to see in one of the slides, I think one of the CCE scenarios, energy efficiency had a fairly small proportion in terms of its contribution to the removal of emissions or net emissions in comparison to other supply side technologies. And to me, that was interesting because energy efficiency has been very successful in developing countries in reducing emissions, but also because presumably by 2050 or even 2075, the world population will be a lot larger and world GDP will be almost double. So to me, energy efficiency would be more important, if not as important. So it's quite interesting to see the balance of those things and you reflect a little bit on where does it fit? Where do different technologies fit and what are they displacing at the margin?
Thank you. That's a very good point. In fact, Mohammed, I'm going to come back to you on that in a second. And I would also like to talk about what happens when you compress the timescale a bit and whether certain technologies suddenly become more important as you move from 2075 to say 2050 net zero. Martin Lambert, you've got your name tag up as well. So,
yeah, thanks. I had two questions. One was about CCS, but I'll hold that for later because what I really wanted to do was to bring the conversation around to the other bits of the circular carbon economy, the reuse and recycle bits, which we haven't spoken much about. Yoshi made a comment about, in their view, one is to do with chemical conversion and one isn't. And okay, that's a definitional thing. I think my real question, though, is around whether it's reusing or recycling. How circular is it in reality? Because I can imagine if you just divert it into some other product, and that carbon then starts as fossil carbon and then ends up in the atmosphere anyway, has that really helped much? Or has it just put off the evil moment when the carbon gets into the atmosphere anyway? So perhaps the speakers can comment on how much value is there really in the reuse and recycle bit.
Thank you. I'm going to come to you in a second, Yoshi, to answer that question, but Mohammed, let me come to you first. Can you address the energy efficiency question and its relevance and whether it becomes more important if you start to contract the timescales that we're talking about?
To be honest, I mean, I haven't looked under the hood on this particular question, and hopefully that can be addressed during the third session with my colleague Fatah Belaid, who will talk about the role of energy efficiency in mitigation scenarios. I see your point. I would have to look under the hood to understand why the model was not showing that, and I see the point about developing versus developed nations in that regard. My sense is that it's all about the assumptions made about the elasticity in the model with that regard in terms of how people are willing to switch to more efficient technologies. But I think one thing to keep in mind is that yes, when we get to look at 2050, things become much more challenging, and you start to see a much larger role for, again, renewables is one obvious one where you see an expansion, a much more expansion in that regard. The downside of it is that you would see more stranded assets because you're pushing much harder, which means for many regions where you have young coal fleets and fossil-based power plants, you're forcing these infrastructures out of market much quicker, which could again have much larger impact on many countries, especially in more of the coal-based nations. And some of the estimates we've looked at in terms of loss of fossil resource revenues could have large implications, especially in regions where they heavily depend on these resources in terms of their GDP. So it would be much more challenging. The other thing I want to highlight as well is that there is this aspect. I mean, in the scenarios we've done, if you looked at that waterfall plot that I showed, and I intentionally wanted to show GHGs instead of CO2s, because we still have a lot of emissions even by then. And I've talked about how challenging it is to get there. And we're talking about the large impact. It's going to cost us a lot as society to get there. But then there are still a lot of GHGs out there that we need to mitigate over time. And if we're not able to put the technology, I mean, IEA had articulated this and many others to say these are the technologies of the future. We need to deploy them at scale, much larger, so they are available and feasible. And definitely the carbon price would be extremely helpful, because if you were to talk to somebody from Aramco, for instance, they would say, well, we've done it, but it doesn't make economic sense. You know, it costs us more. We're losing more of our rent, and we'd rather not do it unless there is a carbon price for it. But the technology is there. I think, hopefully through this COP, we will hear some good news about Article 6 and the operation of Article 6 that could put us on track, where these become, we're able to see these technologies move from more of the technology push. One of the talks I heard earlier this week from a colleague, he was talking about the technology push versus the market pull. And I think we need both mechanisms at play, and we need to move from just the technology push to have the market pull. And if we've got the right governance, the right market mechanism in place, I'm a believer of technologies, and I think if you've got the right setup, the right environment, that we will prevail.
Okay, thank you. Yoshi, let me come to you on that question of reuse and recycle. And I guess there's two elements to it. One is how realistic are they? I mean, what real benefit, what role do they play? I guess the second question for me is do they impact the kind of economic argument as well? Because there's a benefit from the reuse and the recycle, which sort of underpins, if you like, some of the costs of the technologies. So perhaps you could address those, and then I'll come to a couple of comments we've got in the room. Yes,
thank you very much for asking a very important question. I completely agree with the person who raised this question. Although we didn't include our analysis in this year's outlook, we calculated how much carbon can be reduced in each of 4R technology last year's analysis, and we found that the amount of carbon emission reduced in either in recycle or reuse is very small compared to the emission reduction in reduce or remove. So I completely agree with that. The magnitude of adoption of reuse or recycle technologies very limited compared to those in remove or reduce. And also there are various types of technologies in reuse and recycle. One group is about mineralization, and another group is fuels, synthetic fuels, and other groups is about the chemical feedstock. So there are very different types of applications, but we think in relatively mineralization will be more, how can I say, plausible technologies to reduce carbon emission in a large scale at relatively low cost. So we expect that the mineralization should come first in reuse or recycle technologies, and then we may be able to see that the cost of synthetic fuel will reduce in the future, and so that we can expect the adoption of those technologies. And in terms of, I think, can I confirm the question about the economics? Is that economic effect on of the reuse recycle technologies?
Yeah, whether it sort of reduces the overall cost of the new technologies and therefore is an important part of the scenarios.
Yes. The cost of reuse and recycle technology, we expect that will remain high, relatively high compared to the reduce or remove technologies. But in some applications, like I mentioned, in the industry sector or long distance transportation sector like airplane, we will need to some extent those synthetic fuel, which is obviously costlier than conventional oil, but because of the limitation of other technologies, we will need those technology even at the relatively high cost.
Okay, thanks. We've got a couple of comments in the room now, so let me turn to Adam Szyminski first from KAPSARC. Adam.
Thank you very much, James. I wanted to also address very quickly Martin's question. I think it's important, the recycle and reuse options, and I think Yoshikazu's answer is correct. Let me just amplify on that a little bit. People talk about dry ice and beverages, but that's like good for what, a day, a week or something? I mean, it's not going to permanently sequester much of anything. There is fertilizers that extends the time frame. So we're talking about a time frame. Carbon dioxide, SABIC in Saudi Arabia has been making urea out of recycled carbon dioxide. That's good for about a year. So an agricultural season before the carbon goes back in. In some cases, the carbon is actually absorbed by the soils in agriculture. Then there's carbon cured concrete. Roman concrete has been around for a couple of thousand years. Carbon cured concrete is stronger. Again, the volumes might not be great, but there is a huge amount of concrete being used in developing countries, and that's probably a valuable concept. Polymers made from recycled, reused carbon dioxide could also be very long time frame sequestration of carbon. And Yoshikazu mentioned fuels and feedstocks, chemical fuels and feedstocks. So I think that there are opportunities there. I agree that they're limited, but in the framework of the circular carbon economy, trying all of these options and making an effort to see how the economics and the storage economics work is, I think, a really very, very good idea. And there may be, the taxonomy of reduce, reuse, recycle, and remove is, is not absolutely fixed. I mean, there are things that cross over. And I think that there are a lot of, if you think about carbon, and there's technical carbon, and that could be stuff in polymers, for example. There's living carbon, and that's a lot of the nature-based solutions. And then there's fugitive carbon. It's a fugitive carbon we're after. But I think that in the recycle and reuse area, it's possible that we might see some things in not just the technical carbon area, but also in the living carbon area that could be recycled around in the biosphere. And I'm all in favor of experimentation. So Martin, I think I agree with you that right now it seems that these options are relatively limited, but I don't think we should give up. I think that the engineers and economists need to get together and figure out the best ways to make these ideas work in practice. Thank you.
Thanks, Adam. We've got a couple of minutes left. Vaibhav, I could ask you to be relatively brief with your comment. That would be fantastic.
Thank you. The first quick response to the energy efficiency thing, Anupama. I think what the graph showed was an add-on energy efficiency potential compared to the reference. That's what the graph showed. The reference already should be having huge energy efficiency gains. It should be having it, right? And I think that is always there in all the models. I'm always skeptical about that. Would these gains be realized? Because the policies required for energy efficiency are not sort of formally modeled in many of the models. But yes, it's already there. That's the first quick point. The second point on carbon pricing, I think that was a very interesting point that was being made. Carbon pricing is not just about the efficiency of the instrument that we always talk about. It's also a tech agnostic instrument, which is also something very great about it. It's a tech agnostic. But the way we see carbon pricing being employed across economies, it is actually in conjunction with many sectoral policies. So even if it is ETS or it is carbon taxes, there are always going to be a host of policies focusing on energy efficiency, renewable energy, along with carbon pricing. So now what does it mean? So the policy system is not tech agnostic at the end of the day. Even if you have a carbon pricing, the whole policy package is not tech agnostic. That is the reality of what we're seeing. In fact, even the expectation on carbon pricing is that it will never come as a unique instrument. It will always come with a bunch of other instruments. And that is why I'm increasingly thinking about now that for pushing CCS also, we always talk about carbon pricing as a sort of something that will push CCS. It will probably have to be another similar dedicated instrument for pushing CCS, like we have renewable feed-in tariffs or whatever. So it cannot be carbon pricing because it is anyways going to be distorted because of these other RE and energy efficiency kind of policies that will always be there, in the system. So it has to be something like what US, probably experimented with, which is very CCS focused kind of, policy, I think in the last term. Something like that has to happen. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. I think that sort of comment about policies and requiring sort of a governmental push is probably something that takes us into the next session. We've reached 10:15 now, so we're going to stop. But there's a number of questions that have come in which sort of spill over into future discussions. So we'll certainly keep the questions in abeyance. We'll take a 15-minute pause and come back and discuss the two indices I mentioned earlier, which are intended to provide support for policymakers as they make key decisions about which technologies they're going to encourage to achieve energy transition goals. But for the time being, thank you very much to both our speakers, our discussants, and to everyone online for their interventions. And we will see you again in 15 minutes. Do stay online or come back and join us again at 10:30 UK time when we will start session 2. But for the time being, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Okay. Right. Welcome back, everyone. We're going to start the second session now, which is going to focus on, as I mentioned earlier, two relevant indices for the circular carbon economy. As was mentioned earlier, KAPSARC have launched their Circular Carbon Economy Index at COP26, and the World Energy Council recently launched their 2021 World Energy Trilemma Index. So we're going to discuss those indices and how they can support policymaking. And obviously we discussed policymaking in the first session, so it's highly relevant. Also, we'll look at some of the kind of key issues for enabling circular carbon economy and how those are highlighted by the two indices. We have, as in the previous session, a couple of speakers who are going to introduce the two indices. So we have Mary Lowe from KAPSARC and Sir Philip Lowe from the World Energy Council, and they'll be talking in just a minute. And then we have a couple of discussants, Anu Parma-Sen from the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies and Fatih Yilmaz from KAPSARC, who will be making some initial interventions, raising some issues and some initial questions. But as previously, if you would like to intervene in the room, then just use your name tag to highlight your interest in speaking. And online, thank you for the questions earlier. Do continue to use the Q&A box, and we will get to the new questions and indeed some of the questions from the previous session, which we didn't have time to answer during this session. So without further ado, let me turn to Mary Lowe from KAPSARC, who is going to talk about the Circular Carbon Economy Index. Mary, over to you.
Thank you, James. And good morning, good afternoon, everybody. It's my great pleasure to be here on behalf of a team that includes a core team of 3 people who developed this index, but also a broader team back at KAPSARC. And I particularly want to highlight that there is an amazing web portal that displays all these results, which we invite you to look at. We'll have the link in the last slide, but it's ccindex.kapsarc.org. And indeed, we're marking the launch of this index here. It's the first CC Index edition. There will be more to come. And 2 things have guided our work. One is that, as we know, in order to manage, you need to measure. So we have this concept, but it's a bit unclear what it means in practice. So to support implementation, we've developed 47 indicators that we hope will apply and be useful for all countries, different kinds of countries. And we're launching this first edition with 30 countries to show how it works. The other guiding principle has been that there's no silver bullet. We need all hands on deck. As we heard in the previous session, the spirit of the CC is all tools in the toolbox and trying to see what makes economic sense and what is also equitable. Right. So what is the CCE? I know colleagues have shown different conceptualizations, and here's yet another. And this is one that's been developed by KAPSARC over the past couple of years. There's another website called ccguide.org that lays this out very nicely. It's a collaborative effort with a number of big international energy agencies. And so it's the 4 R's here as well. We divide them a bit differently along the different R's, but essentially it's the same idea. The avoidance of CO2 emissions is the ultimate goal. 4 pillars and CC, essentially what people often, when they hear CCE, they think of circular economy. The big difference here is that CCE is specifically about emissions and energy, where circular economy is more about materials and products. It's a holistic concept, as we've heard, and the aim is essentially to ultimately reach net zero emissions, but do that effectively and also do things in the short term, as we heard in the last session. It's a concept that's been promoted a lot by Saudi, different actors in Saudi, including KAPSARC, including researchers, and increasingly picked up by academics in other countries, which we're very delighted about. It was endorsed by the G20 leaders, and at the core of it is it's voluntary and it's holistic, and each country has its own solution and pathway. Now, what is the CC Index? It's a tool that we've developed for climate and energy policy makers and stakeholders worldwide in an attempt to quantify and compare country performance specifically. So this focuses on the country level. So how do they perform and what is their potential to make progress? So we aim to support domestic planning with this and enable data-driven discussions. So not only about the rankings, but I'm sure you'll be all excited to see what the rankings are, and we'll do that just in a bit. Before we do that, I want to show you a quick overview of the framework of the index. We have on the website, ccindex.kapsarc.org, a full methodological paper. We have a results analysis. So I'll simply be giving you some highlights here. The CC Index score is a composite of 2 scores. One is what countries are doing at the moment, how well are they doing it? And the other one is how well are they positioned to make progress going forward towards net zero and CCEs. And underpinning these, we have these 47 different indicators. So each gray bar here indicates one area that we're measuring with a quantitative indicator from a harmonized international data set. And we'll look at these in a bit more closely shortly. In addition, we're adding this a bit more experimental lens which we want to use to enable more meaningful comparisons across and between oil producers specifically. So of these 30 countries, to 19 oil producers, we apply an additional score that adds a set of indicators that focuses specifically on how the oil and gas industries of these countries are performing and are placed to make progress in a net zero world. What can we do with an index like this? We can answer a number of questions, and that's what indices are for. They're for enabling discussions about data and asking questions about why is my country where it is, and why is it performing well or less well in one place or another. We specifically try and answer the following questions. On the performance side, how are countries engaging in terms of diversity of the different technologies under the CCE, but also how well are they doing that? And the future-oriented dimension looks at how are countries positioned to make progress going forward. And then we have this oil lens that I already talked about. 30 countries in the first edition, and here are the countries that we apply the oil producers lens to. And then some high-level messages before we show the full set of scores, and there you already see the top performers. But the high-level message is, as we heard in the first session, there remains significant work. Of course, we're not there yet, a lot of implementation to go. So no country is obviously even close to a CCE today. The top 3 countries in our index this year, Norway, UK, and Germany, they demonstrate strong performance on both these dimensions that we're measuring. In the area of performance, when we look at the 30 countries, in the areas of energy efficiency on the one hand and electrification and renewables on the other is where most of the performance scores come from. So these are currently still making the major contribution to countries' CC performance. In enablers, and this is where we're going to spend a lot of time hopefully today, we identified 3 major gaps across countries. So meaning some countries are doing better, others a lot less so, and we need a lot of attention in these 3 areas: their policies, technology, and finance. And then also we'll give some highlights on how the oil producers lens can be used and what it means in practice. Now to the scores and the rankings. So here's the first CC index. And one thing to highlight here is that, as you see, there are big differences between the top and the bottom performers, meaning that we need to think about these countries, that not just the ones that are leading and how great they are and how good lessons we can learn from them, but also the countries that are towards the bottom end, because all these countries, they're major economies, they're major oil producers. They do have a significant share of current emissions and future emissions. So all these countries need to be brought along in the transition. Drilling in a bit more into the performance index, here you can see how we're measuring these different areas. And just to give an idea, the energy efficiency is simply the energy intensity of the economy. Renewables is the share of renewables in the energy mix, and so forth. And when you look at the top performers, you will see that all of them have broad engagement on 4 or even 5 of these different areas of CCE that we're measuring, which includes green hydrogen, which includes CCUS. On the reuse one, I want to highlight that this is a gap in our framework, because as we were talking earlier on, things are not scaled up yet. So things like carbon cured concrete have huge potential in actually retaining carbon, but we cannot measure it yet. The data is not there and implementation hasn't been scaled up yet. In the area of enablers, we have these 5 conceptual areas of enablers that we mentioned, each underpinned by a number of indicators. And here there are 3 areas where we're going to zoom in, which are finance, technology, and policies. And here, if you look at the distribution of the scores again, you'll see that there are big differences between the top and the bottom performers in the index. On policies and regulation, what we measure are regulatory and policy support frameworks for things like energy efficiency, renewables, CCS, and natural sinks, among other things, MRV of emissions also, and climate policy overall. And again, we see quite a bit of differences between countries. Same in technology. If you look at R&D, for example, which we're measuring with the general R&D score, there's not yet data where we could look at just CCE relevant in R&D investments. We measure clean technology patents. Also, there we were able to get data that's specific. And then academic publications, you see that after the first 10 or so countries, the scores really start dropping, which means that there are huge gaps in this area of technology as well among countries. Same applies to finance, which probably has the steepest line there going down. Again, there are countries that are doing pretty well in terms of investing in things like renewables, fuel cells. They are providing sustainable bonds. They are providing overall good access to private sector to finance. But as you go down, this quickly drops, and it's a key area where we need scaling up urgently. Then very briefly on the oil producers lens, there we have the 19 countries, major oil producers. We couldn't include Libya because Libya doesn't have enough data, unfortunately, on these indicators. So 19 countries, and the rankings do not change significantly. But if you look at the portal, if you look at the indicators that we're measuring, there are some really interesting differences when you measure, for example, the carbon intensity of a country's oil production, or how they're positioned in terms of preparedness for net zero. One example of what we can do with the scores, we have plotted on the x-axis there, the enabler score for the oil producers. And then we're looking at how dependent, how much they rely on fuel exports. And one message that one can take from this is that apart from the fact that we have these four quite sort of clear groups here, is that economic diversification will be a key part of the equation for oil revenue, oil export dependent countries as part of the CCE. So of course it's diversification, both vertically and horizontally for these countries. A few more snapshots of what this index can be used for. Sometimes it's more meaningful for governments, for policymakers to look at regional groups when they look for policy lessons. So here we see quite a bit of variation in the scores between Europe and Africa, for example. And the other thing we can do is look at income levels. And again, there are some differences. So for countries, again, more meaningful perhaps to compare with more similar countries than just with the top performer of the overall index. And the website that we have enables these kind of comparisons as well at a very detailed level. So again, I invite you to look at that. I'll leave you with some high-level messages just to recap. So there are still large unexploited opportunities. There's good momentum now, especially coming out of the COP. We have really good net zero targets and some improvement on the NDCs, but we need to get down to work and support, whether it be international cooperation, whether it be technology, finance, that really needs to be an area of focus, policy as well. Keeping in mind that country circumstances are diverse. When you look at the different performance scores of countries, you will see that their path dependencies, their preferences, their endowments influence how they're going to be going about and how they're going about at the moment on this net zero transition path. On the next steps, we will be launching some additional features at the Dubai Expo in January. And we are also very, very open and welcome to your feedback, because we want to build this index more and make it something that all countries can use and engage with. So please do get in touch with us. There's the website. It's beautiful. We have a lovely team at KAPSARC who made this possible. Some more screenshots. And we have a bunch of papers there, including a really interesting case study on Saudi Arabia that just came out, where we look at how could you apply this index in practice to a country like Saudi Arabia, look at the different policies, and I'll leave you with that. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Mary. Very interesting. Lots of useful data. I've certainly got lots of questions around the interpretation of the data and some of the issues you've raised. If you've got questions online, then please do put them in the Q&A box. And again, I would encourage everyone around the room to use your name tag to highlight if you want to raise an issue as well. Before we come to the discussion, though, let me turn to Philip Lowe from the World Energy Council, who's going to hopefully share some slides and talk us through the Trilemma Index. Philip, I'll let you try and share your screen first. And if that fails, we can always share the slides from here, but you have a go first.
I'll have a go first. Good morning, everyone, and apologize for the delay. We should be... Can we actually load them up from your end,
Yes, let me just ask the technical guys if they can do that. I've got a nodding head. Here we go. Yes, there we go.
Okay. So again, thank you, Jim, for the introduction, and thank you to everyone for being part of this discussion on how you, as as Mary mentioned, how you measure performance and what the ultimate objectives of that measurement are. Now, the World Energy Council has been working for more than 12 years on an index which would enable governments as well as investors, civil society, and ordinary people to judge what is the right balance of policies and regulations to produce an ideal energy policy for any country concerned. We are in a position that we have already more than 110 countries covered by this index. As Mary said, one of the major challenges in these exercises is to obtain the data, but over the years, over the last 12 years, we've been able to refine the methodology, refine the data, and provide a rather comprehensive view as to what's happening in terms of energy policies and the trade-offs between the various aspects of any energy policy. Of course, the major concept behind this index is the balance to be achieved between three major aims of energy policy to ensure that you have adequate security of supply, to ensure also that you are providing energy on as wide a accessibility basis as possible, and that it's affordable. And finally, the issue of is your energy policy environmentally sustainable? Now that last objective has been widened considerably in the last 5 to 10 years by the accent placed upon the reduction of CO2 and GHG emissions. And if I could go first of all to the next slide, if it's possible. I referred to how the index has been built up over the last 12 years. And on the next slide, you see after this one, on the third slide, you see basically the triangle of these three objectives. Behind each of the indices which we've built up for the three corners of the trilemma, the overall index covers, I would say, around 30 different indicators which build up to an index for energy security, environmental stability, and energy equity, covering affordability and accessibility. Next slide, please. In addition, of course, to those three major aspects of an energy policy, we have to take into account the country context, the macroeconomic context of the countries concerned, and also the maturity of the policies and the regulations put in place, and the institutions which allow energy policies to be effective. And this initial slide simply gives you an indication of some of the breakdown of some of the aspects of energy security. Obviously, if you have a country which is rich in minerals, maybe in fossil fuels, you can say it has a absolutely reliable energy system. On the other hand, if the future of its energy policy relies solely on fossil fuels, there is obviously a problem in relation to environmental sustainability objectives. And there may also be a problem in terms of the degree to which, in the longer term, that energy based on fossil fuels can be delivered affordably to the populations concerned. Resilience, of course, is a fundamental aspect of security supply, and that's reflected in the Energy Security Index. Next slide, please. On affordability and access, obviously, you've got many situations where there is a crying need to expand accessibility of energy supplies, in particular in developing countries in Africa and elsewhere. Perhaps this is aided to some extent by the capacity for energy systems to be developed on a localized basis through renewables. But for the moment, in many countries, there is still a reliance on rather weak centralized infrastructures for electricity. And the issue of affordability is also very relevant to this part of the index. To what extent not only is energy affordable for households, but is it cost competitive for industry based in the countries concerned? These are things which are extremely important from the point of view, for example, of investors looking at the energy systems of different countries. Next slide, please. In terms of environmental stability and sustainability, I think you can see from the CCE index and others, there is on their side particular emphasis on CO2 and GHG emissions reduction. However, we're also looking through this index, and the indicators are contained in the environmental stability triangle, part of the triangle, at other aspects of sustainability, particularly air pollution, in, for example, countries like India and China, where the move towards lower carbon sources of electricity, of energy, is as much motivated by those pollutants as it is simply by the issue of CO2 reduction and GHG emissions. More wider than that, one can say that in certain countries too, the issues of efficient uses of resources, the efficiency of energy infrastructure and avoiding wasted energy is extremely important. And the degradation of the natural environment is something which needs to be taken into account. These issues are not all reflected in our indicators, but they are an important part of the concept of overall environmental sustainability of energy systems. Next slide, please. I referred to the degree to which, irrespective of how ideal your energy policy is, there is a need for a macroeconomic political context which allows you to implement it effectively. Next slide, please. Now, I won't go into the detail of the aggregation of the scores and the grades given, but as indeed Gary has pointed out from the CC index, one of the most attractive aspects of the Trilemma Index for countries and for many people involved in the development of effective energy policies is to be able to compare the performance of their country or their region against those of other regions. To that extent, even though there are some hesitations about ranking countries. The Trilemma Index already raises issues which allows a dialogue to take place within the country and beyond on what can be done to achieve a better and more effective policy. When I say a better and more effective policy, that can be something which can vary over time. In principle, the potential conflict between sustainability and affordability and accessibility may mean that in the shorter term, countries which are developing their economies and societies would prefer to rank environmental sustainability at a lower level than affordability. But in the longer term, they also have to ensure for their societies a degree of environmental sustainability, particularly as far as GHG emissions are concerned. Next slide, please. Now, this is the kind of table which interests most people. You know, why is Sweden top, and why is Switzerland and Denmark second and third? Where is my country in this ranking? Well, taking a snapshot of different countries' positions at one particular time is not in itself indicative without some degree of analysis and dialogue as to the differences in the situations of different countries. We've also, looking at the experience with past reports which we produce annually, we've added to that snapshot ranking another ranking which tries to measure the improvements made by countries in their energy position on the three aspects of the trilemma. So on the right-hand side of this table, you see a list of countries who do not normally appear in a high ranking, like the one which I referred for CCE, but where there's been significant improvement on one or other of the aspects of the energy trilemma. Next slide, please. This ranking can also be reflected in the relative position of different regions of the world. You can see this, the top 25% in terms of the ranking are shown in dark brown there. Those with much more challenges are in blue and dark blue. Next slide, please. We've just, for the benefit of subsequent reading and study, indicated here that apart from the overall trilemma ranking, we've been able to look closely at how countries rank on one aspect of the trilemma. This applies here for energy security, but also later on for, as we'll see on the next slide for energy equity, where the issue of accessibility dominates very strongly that right-hand column of improvers. You know, to what extent are they now able to offer their populations a much more resilient and steady supply of energy to households and to business. And finally, the same applies on the last slide here on energy on environmental sustainability, which I think is the next slide. We have there again some improvers, some surprising improvers in the sense that, for example, you'd expect the prospects for improvement in developed countries may be less than in developing and emerging countries. But you see the position here of Denmark and Ireland as an illustration of the extent to which, for example, by withdrawing from coal generation and moving towards renewables, some countries have made significant progress in recent years. Next slide, please. Well, that's the sum of a very rough summary of what is in this year's Trilemma Index report. As been discussed earlier, there are no ideal templates for effective energy policies, but there is a need for some degree of structure in the discussion about what is an ideal energy policy. It's the Trilemma Index itself and also the debates around it are highlighted, are enhanced and made more important by the issue of the circular economy, but also particularly of CO2 reductions. The Trilemma highlights the trade-offs which need to be made over time between the different corners of the Trilemma, but also in terms of what are acceptable socially, economically, and environmentally certain policy objectives which can be pursued. Those objectives maybe have a different mix in different countries. That's where the comparisons across countries can be very, very useful to achieve a final result. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Philip. That was very, very interesting, and I'm sure again we'll inspire. Well, we're already getting some questions coming in, so we'll come to those in a second. If I can quickly turn to our two discussants for their thoughts. I'm going to come to Anupama first, if I may, for some thoughts on the circular carbon economy and the other index as well. If you could keep your comments reasonably short, we've got plenty of questions as well. Thanks.
Sure. Yeah, thanks very much. Two great presentations. I just had some sort of general reflections, and perhaps I wanted to raise some questions around the circular carbon economy index and sort of how can it be used? How can it be implemented by policymakers? What are the sorts of issues and questions that one would be looking at? And I'd like to draw a little bit from the wider literature on circular economy, and on which OIS published a paper a few months ago as well, the wider circular economy literature. So basically, circular economy is about utilizing a more intensive utilization of an existing stock of resources and eventually of a reducing stock of resources. So it is about efficiency at the heart of it. And so it's reduce, recycle, reuse, and the circular carbon economy builds on that and adds remove to it as well. And I think that sort of the first point I'd like to make is that the focus on remove, to me, as another indicator of stock, is an interesting one with interesting implications. I think it needs to be linked quite closely to the reuse element. And I think sort of in the medium term, there is room for policymakers who adopt the CCE index to think about how basically the reuse element becomes relatively more important in comparison to the remove element. And I think that then brings in really the value of the circular carbon economy approach. I think in the last session, Adam made a very good point. He said the taxonomy of these things is not fixed. And I think that's sort of an interesting thing to take into account. But I think that one could more closely link it to circularity if you focus less on the removal aspect and focus more on where the value add is, basically, which is in the reuse, the utilization of carbon through chemical conversion processes, as was being talked about in the first session. So otherwise, the focus ends up, I think, risks ending up very much on remove. The second sort of quick point I wanted to make, again, drawing from the literature on the circular economy, is sometimes the empirical evidence has shown that circular economy approaches are not necessarily ones that result in less energy being used. Indeed, if you take examples within the circular economy framework of recycling, the recycling of certain goods and products, like plastics, for instance, or critical materials, ends up using more energy than is actually used to produce them. And so I think this raises an interesting question around how much energy would one be using in a circular carbon economy versus a non-circular economy or a linear economy. And I think there's a nice discussion or a debate to be had around that as well. And of course, the technical sort of term for that is the rebound effect. So how do you basically watch for the rebound effect or for the unintended consequences of circular economy measures, and how can policymakers then mitigate for those effects and bake those into the implementation of the indicators? So I think that's sort of a quick second point that I would make. And I think the third quick point that I would make is perhaps also more of a question. The circular economy approach thus far, I would argue, has been implemented within organizations and businesses, and it's been targeted at improving allocative and technical efficiency. And in doing that, businesses reduce their materials consumption. They use indicators which show that, and it also raises new revenue streams, new value propositions for the businesses themselves. And I know we're going to talk about this in the third session, but the point I wanted to raise was to what level of granularity can the circular carbon indicators be taken? Can they be implemented at an organizational level? What do they look like? In terms of practical implementation, in terms of timeframes, and in terms of getting a country to net zero. So I think that these are sorts of three broad areas of reflection or maybe of questions that I would raise. I guess I'll end on sort of a final point, which is taking into consideration the demand side as well, and whether there's any room or scope to take into consideration demand side factors when looking at the circular carbon economy indicators in terms of enablers as well. So I think those are the broad points I'd like to quickly make, and I'll stop there.
Annie Palmer, thank you very much indeed. Some interesting points you've raised, and I've noted quite a few questions that come out as a result of that. Let me turn, before we get to the Q&A, to Fatih Yilmaz from KAPSARC, who's got a few comments to make, I think, particularly about circular carbon economy. Fatih, over to you.
Thank you very much to all presenters for bringing very, very valuable and interesting insights from the two extremely useful in the indices. Well, indices are extremely useful tools to summarize, obviously, complex concepts and track their progress over time, such as the energy transition. So there is basically a very granular methodology behind the numbers that we tend to actually miss when we look at the ranks and the scores that these indices have provide us. So I want to just point this out, that identifying the key components of complex process such as the energy transition, finding the relevant indicators, measuring these concepts, putting all the data together, using several statistical tools. So there is a granular methodology behind the numbers, which I would like to hear our speakers, our presenters points on that. What will be the most sort of biggest challenges through this journey? The two indices provide, interestingly and importantly, provide two different aspects of the energy transition, where the CCE focuses on how you do the transition, how you go through it, where the Trilemma Index focuses more on the how you balance the three areas. So in that sense, I see there is a common sense across the two indices, and they complement each other in terms of their messages. So on their messages, obviously any index or indices in general have sort of broad, global, high-level messages and country-level messages. So I want to point out some of the key messages that we get from these two indices, and wanted to explore more discussion perhaps on these messages. So the CCE index, as Mari has already shown, has two components: the performance and the enablers part, enabler sub-index. So the performance, the key sort of message we get from the performance part, the broader the variety of the CCE activities that countries engage, they perform better. So there is this holistic or flexible approach that CCE brings to the picture. That is important. And from the enablers part, Murray has already pointed out that the finance, technology, and policy progress or framework, stand out as the most critical gaps that we see across countries. So obviously we want to ask questions like why or what type of finance that we are talking about. We have obviously trillions of finance available in the world, but what not in this particular context? Now turning to the Trilemma Index, obviously it's been an old index. It's out there that we all follow it, read the reports, and follow the numbers. But I would like to hear Philip's comments on how are we doing historically? How is the historical trend going so far in terms of, are we balancing the three dimensions, or are we actually trading one for another? So what is your reflection on that? In terms of the country level messages, both indices obviously provide various reports and interactive tools where everybody go and check their favorite country relative to different groups, income, region, or similar groups. But I guess the bigger challenge or sort of the question, how can we really get these indices into country contexts to create constructive policy discussion within a country context? Murray has already mentioned one of the short notes that we put out looking at the specific Saudi Arabia's case, but can we actually, or should we actually do more of this and try to utilize this information at the country level in a different policy context? That's my first reactions. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I think that raises some really interesting points, and that there are a couple of questions that kind of highlight this question of balance and how the indices should be used, and how countries, if they want to improve their scores, should focus on the different measures. And is there any indication about what you should focus on and prioritize first? And so do the indices help countries perhaps at the bottom end of the scoring range to decide where to start? That's one of the questions that's come in. If you're a major coal producing and exporting country down at the bottom of the list, how do you decide what to focus on first? Mary, your reflections on that.
So thank you for all the discussants, and James also for that good question. I think there's a lot to unpack there, definitely. One thing to point out about the CC index is that in this first edition, we took major economies only and on oil producing countries. So when you look at the ETI, the Trilemma Index, you will see a lot of small countries ranking at the top. And so our approach was to start with countries that actually produce a large amount of the world's emissions, and start there, get a good, robust set of indicators where we have good data availability, and then expand it going forward. So there's an interesting, we'll see how we found quite a bit of correlation when we looked at, I think about 70 or 80% between the rankings of these two indices when we compared them. So we'll see when we get more countries in our index, how that will happen. In terms of comparing, I sort of learning policy lessons, indeed, I think I have a question to Philip in terms of what can countries do if you are a country that's developing and there is a focus on affordability, and you're looking at the top scoring countries there, and you just said that countries have different objectives and the Trilemma Index looks at these three areas, but if the goal is net zero, so how can countries use the Trilemma Index as a tool? That would be my question to you, but I'll very quickly touch on a couple of points that Anupama and Fatih raised, if I may, just 1 minute. On what we could do with the CC index framework or the CCE concept, whether to take it to an organizational level. I think that's a fantastic idea. What we encountered, even when looking for oil sector metrics, is that there's a huge lack of harmonized data on different metrics. And so the challenge there would be, yes, we can do comparisons that are useful for a country maybe, but then taking that to the global level might be a challenge. But yes, definitely in a country context, the CCE sort of lens probably renders to interesting indicators. And there on remove, I think in terms of remove and reuse, these are slightly different. So as we understand remove, it's CCS and it's also natural sinks. And there we think the big gap is finance, it's policy. Whereas let's remove. When you look at reuse, things like cured concrete, polymers, things that capture carbon over long periods of time, yes, definitely the big driver there is the economic value added. And that's a big part of this whole CC concept of not just thinking about where can we reduce emissions, but where can we do that efficiently and perhaps even generate value there. So I think there we need more data. And that would be hopefully a driver then for further discussions in that area. And I want to point out one final interesting thing that came out of so we can always question, what are these indices useful for? So the question might be, how does the CC performance index, what does it help? How does it help? I think Philip may have brought this up. How does it help us to understand where we are when making progress? Does it actually measure what it's supposed to measure? So we compared the performance score to countries' CO2 intensity, because the ultimate goal of the CC is net zero emissions. So the best proxy for that is how much are you emitting? And we have to normalize that because countries are at different sizes. We can't look at total emissions. So we looked at CO2 intensity and we found a correlation of 75%. So the CC index not just measures how well countries are engaging in a diversity of options, but it also measures what the outcomes are. So I'll leave you with that.
Okay, Philip, let me come to you. If I could ask, we've got quite a few questions and comments in the room to come. So if you could be a little brief, if you don't mind. But how would a country use the Trilemma Index to improve its performance? And how would it prioritize where to focus first? I think is one of the big questions that's come in.
Well, and also following up a previous question, historically, how has performance changed? And I think that the overall comment to be made is that there has been a lot of progress on affordability and accessibility of energy throughout the world. It's not surprising, because if you look at progress towards Millennium Goals, to the progress of expansion of industrial development everywhere, things have gone relatively well for a lot of emerging and developing countries compared with 30, 40 years ago. However, if you then look at the present situation, the issue of environmental sustainability has become uncomfortably part of their trilemma. They've got to deal with that. And in relation to what Mari's just said, necessarily, given that countries are in different positions, and you're all in the margin of COP26, you very well know that the achievement of COP26 objectives overall has to take into account those differences, the distributive effects of trying to meet environmental sustainability objectives overall for the world as a whole. So there's a just transition there to be dealt with. One can talk about environmental objectives being wishy-washy or hypocritical, etc. But in the end, on the side of the developing countries and emerging countries, there's got to be some kind of agreement with the rest of the world as to how they're actually going to achieve these objectives. I take a few examples. I mean, even in Europe, which is substantially more developed, Poland relies for at least 150,000 people in terms of employment on the coal sector. It took the Western Europe 30 years to withdraw from the coal sector and develop other sources of energy. Are we expecting Poland to do that in 5 years? In which case, how can Poland do it? Then you look at Russia and Nigeria, who say, well, we've got a lot of resources. And we've got to feed our populations. We've got to make a choice there. How do we get there? You say that we can't use or export so many fossil fuels anymore. Well, there is a redistributive effect worldwide, but there's also a need for some degree of planning and coordination as to how the transition takes place in those countries. And so that emphasizes even more what Mary referred to as of letting every single possible contribution be accepted to achieve those objectives. In countries like Russia and Nigeria, it's extremely important for that transition to manage to achieve some milestones in the trade-offs of the trilemma over the years, to say, well, we can't do that by 2025. We might be able to do it by 2035, but we will be able to do it by 2055 or 2050, whatever. If you add all those different debates at national level into the global challenge, it's still very, very difficult. But historically, we've improved on affordability, accessibility, and security of supply, but we've got a big challenge on the environmental transition. So that's I'll try to keep it there, Jim.
Okay, thank you very much, Philip. So we've got a couple of comments in the room. Jonathan, can I come to you first for your thought?
Yes, could I just check with both Murray and Philip? I'm not clear whether the metrics actually measure performance against stated policies, because let me be critical of my own country rather than anybody else's. There's a lot of criticism within the UK, including from not just protesters, but the UK Climate Change Committee, that the government is not on track to meet its own policy commitments. Now, to what extent do your metrics measure that dimension of progress?
Mary, do you want to take that one?
Sure, a very brief answer. We didn't add that dimension. And also another question we get is, why don't you measure CO2 directly? And what we wanted to create on the performance side is a suite of metrics that reflects the diversity of the technologies that are needed for the CC. And we could keep adding things, but there's a sweet balance between the value, sort of how the index can be communicated in a way that is useful for policymakers. So we chose that representation of the use of different engagement with different technologies. So what is in your CCS pipeline? How much do you have of CCS? How about green hydrogen? What is the share of renewables in your energy mix? What's the share of nuclear and so forth? So short answer, we don't measure that, but then we do look at the enablers part. And I think there's a climate change policy index. I think they launched yesterday. They launched the recent edition last year by Joan Watch and others, and they measure specifically this dimension. And we integrate one of those indicators of climate policy in our index as well.
Vaibhav, you've got a comment to make. Let me turn to you next.
Great, thank you. So I think for all these global trackers and indexes, the question of legitimacy is absolutely important. Because the question of how do individual countries view these trackers and indexes, countries will sort of use them only when they consider it legitimate, and legitimacy does not come automatically just because it's a great research, right? I'll just take a minute in terms of what happened with the climate action tracker, which is probably one of the most cited global action trackers. Yesterday they released a report and the reaction that it's getting, and when we unpack the results, what we see that they've clearly said that we are using these least cost models in our rankings, and it simply means the world has to peak by 2020. Every country, even the developing world, has to peak by 2020, and hence these actions are critically insufficient and all that, right? So saying that so upfront that we are only thinking about this global science and we have kind of ignored the principles of CBDR, fairness index, very upfront, in the sense when they were questioned, that's what the response is. They've totally lost credibility. That is absolutely important for us to understand, because now countries are saying, well, why are you getting into the politics? You're supposed to be an academic institution. You're not supposed to comment on individual countries, whether they are sufficient, insufficient. And if you want to do, it is totally fine, but do consider the questions of fairness, equity, CBDR. And so getting into the legitimacy question is critical. The question is, how do you do it? So either you make it in some way, some fairness index and something like that. That makes it somewhat legitimate, or either you do it at least partially in some bottom-up kind of way, which means you are actually getting some information from some country experts. And the question of policy, you are measuring only progress against a country's policies. That also makes it sort of bottom-up. So you're not talking about this global, net zero debate by 2050 or something else. So that is, I think that legitimacy question has to be thought about in a real way. Only then countries will start thinking about using, these kind of global indexes for informing their own, policy and actions.
Okay, thank you very much. I guess the other question that is around this kind of equity issue question is that you highlighted that the huge gaps between those at the top and the bottom of the scores, particularly Murray, on technology and finance. And I guess intuitively, these indices are somewhat competitive. I mean, Philip raised the point about countries wanting to know where they are on the index score, whereas there's a collaborative element to this. I mean, in terms of technology, presumably the countries at the bottom are going to improve because technology is shared. And is there a way that the index kind of measures a collaborative element of both technology sharing and provision of finance, so that countries at the top of the index get some merit from sharing with those at the bottom of the index? Is there a way that the index helps with that? I think you're being pointed at to answer that question, so I'm going to turn to you.
Sure. Well, just before getting to this question, let me just make this general comment. Any index is legitimate within its own methodology. So it's all relative to whatever the min-max is, whatever the methodological framework you have. So I think we shouldn't expect too much from the indices other than what they are methodologically capable of delivering. So, so back to your question, for instance, in the CCE index, the technology dimension tries to capture technology creation, diffusion, and absorption. So we have 5 or 6 matrices trying to capture these elements. So for instance, the technology diffusion section is obviously how technologies in country X is diffused to the rest of the world, and how the rest of the world or another country is able to absorb this technology. So in that sense, we have this collaborative effort, but of course you have limitations based on the available data out there. So you have to balance between all these constraints and objectives. In terms of the finance, for instance, we see obviously we all know without looking at an index that the size of the sustainable finance is very little compared to what is the conventional one. And when you look at the distribution of this very little available sustainable finance, it's very uneven across the countries. And then you wonder, obviously, why, X group of countries are getting more than Y group of countries. So when you look at it, obviously, in many developed economies, particularly European countries, they have not very well, but they have some developed infrastructure for sustainable finance instruments to flourish. So they are able to attract these flows, where in many other economies they haven't have the taxonomy, they don't even have the institutional setup yet. So we do try to look at it from that window. In terms of the collaboration across countries, in terms of financial flows, for example, under the finance dimension, we do have indicators for international financial connectedness. How countries are, attached to the rest of the world in terms of financial flows. So these are some general reflections. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. We've got another comment in the room. Lauren, do you want to say something?
Thank you so much for these really interesting presentations about these indices. I have a brief methodological question that I wonder if Philip could answer, just from the trajectory of the evolution of that in your index, and sort of what you described as the need for it to become perhaps more robust in certain ways, and also maybe for Mari looking into the future as your index continues to evolve to accommodate data as it gets better, or as we try to sort of, I think one of the benefits of the circular economy framework from any perspective is that it sort of internalizes otherwise externalized sort of elements that are, not normally taken into consideration in sort of more traditional frameworks. So my question is, when you're comparing across time, and you're able to include new, more robust forms of data, how do we then compare the index, that didn't necessarily include those to like, are you retroactively sort of measuring, or how can we sort of accommodate for a balancing between like integrating new elements and also making sure that it's consistent across time and comparable?
Okay, so I guess we're coming to the end of our time, so this is probably the last question. So I'm going to come to Mary first and say, how are you going to improve? And then Philip, I'll come to you finally and allow you to answer the question about how things have changed over time. Mary, you go first.
So thank you, James. We obviously have an amazing index, but as anything, it's not perfect. So again, please take a look at the website. You'll see all the methodological notes there. You can toggle all the indicators, do comparisons. On the question of how does the time sort of dimension work, we will add time series every year. So from now on, every year we're updating it. And as we update the indicator framework, of course, that makes it not comparable across years, but we will be able to use the data from the previous year and then look backwards. We're making all the data available, so feel free to take a look at it, and I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much.
Okay, Philip, last word to you. So how have things changed, or how have things improved over time? And have you made the data comparable, I guess is the question.
Well, I'd just like to say that our now quite long experience of collecting data, establishing this index, and also dialoguing with countries on what does it mean for them, has convinced us that there are three things which are essential for it to be credible. First of all, it's got to be based on objective data, which allows international comparison, and that limits you. It's always historical. You can't refer to different policy objectives set by governments. That's a little bit more vague to discuss. The indicators have to be accessible, understandable by people. Chris talked earlier about humanizing energy, but humanizing energy also is explaining to people what are the fundamental parameters of energy. So it's got to be accessible to the language of our index has to be accessible to people, and it's got to be as transparent as possible. So in the back of our reports every year, you have extensive pages of discussion of different indices, which form the basis for the three final and the ultimate index, Trilemma Index. And in those indices, apart from the three corners of environmental sustainability, equity, and security, we have on average around 10% of the index devoted to factors such as institutional stability, such as availability of finance, which allow us to give some degree of credibility to the overall index. But an index like this is only the start each year of a dialogue as to how a country has progressed. And by providing a fairly transparent, accessible index with international comparisons, each country, whether it's governments or civic society or investors, can say, well, okay, why are we putting so much emphasis on, for example, CCS, when we know that for us there are alternatives to that? Why is it that we have less confidence in certain technologies rather than others? These questions get different answers in different countries. But at least the index which we're providing, which needs continuous improvement, shows that there is a progression in policy, that irrespective of what a government actually sets out as its objectives, there are objective milestones to what's happening in terms of accessibility, for example, in terms of security of supply, diversity of supplies, and these allow any society and economy to study the results of the ranking and say, well, okay, why is it that Indonesia, for example, is performing better than the Philippines? Why are we in Indonesia in a bad position? And that analysis, through the interplay through the examination of the various trade-offs which have been made between the three corners of the index, but also over time, is in my view, on the whole, very valuable.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And as we've actually gone slightly over time because it's been a very fascinating and rich conversation, I'd just like to thank particularly our two speakers, Mary and Philip, for their contributions, which were excellent, and also for all the questions and discussions from the online and also the live panel. I think that conclusion that both indices are useful within the boundaries of their own methodologies, but also as the basis for a discussion, and they're not the end point, they're the starting point, I think is very useful conclusions to reach. So thank you very much indeed. We're going to take a short break now for about 55 minutes and be back at 12:30 UK time for the third session on the key enablers for the circular carbon economy. As I say, particularly focused on hydrogen, biofuels, and CCUS. So do rejoin us then. And for the time being, thank you very much indeed. And see you in about 55 minutes time. Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to those online. Well done for staying with us. Delighted to see so many people still there. And to those in the room, welcome back from lunch. Just a reminder that as we go into session 3, your interactivity so far has been fantastic. Keep questions and comments coming through the Q&A button online, and in the room, for anyone who's just arrived, to take your name tag, stick it vertically, and then I'll know that you want to make an intervention. So session 3 is about the enablers of the CCE concept, and we're going to get into some technologies and then no doubt discuss financial implications and political ones as well of the implementation of those technologies. And we've got 3 speakers for this session. I have asked Olivia how to pronounce her name and I've forgotten, so I'm going to have a shot at it. Olivia Azadagan from the Clean Air Task Force, Martin Lambert from OIES, and Fateh Belaid from KAPSARC are going to be our speakers. And then we have 2 discussants, Rami Shabaneh from KAPSARC and Joseph Steckley from EPRI, who is online and who I can see, so that's great. So without further ado, because we've only got an hour, let me hand the floor to Olivia, who is going to talk to us, I think, about CCUS. Olivia, over to you.
Great, thanks, James. Hi, my name is Olivia Azadigan, Clean Air Task Force. We are an environmental organization focused on enabling policies to get to net zero emissions with high energy at an affordable cost. We're based between the US, Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. So the diagram here shows what CATF envisions as a decarbonized energy system. So this has different components with 2 primary energy vectors, electricity and what we call zero carbon fuels, which will be enabled by primary energy production methods, renewables, nuclear, and CCUS to enable zero carbon fuels or hydrogen. And in order to achieve this, we need incentives for innovation and to reduce the cost of these technologies with long-term policy certainty. And whilst driving comprehensive climate policy. So this is not about diverting resources away from any other decarbonization technologies, but it's about a diverse portfolio that is needed to enable a decarbonized energy system. So the need for deep decarbonization and its challenges. So industrial decarbonization presents one of the hardest climate challenges. This is about 20% of global CO2 emissions. And the longer we ignore this, the harder it will become to abate. And there's little we can do to do this without carbon management technologies. And this is also about retrofitting what we have already created, which will be key to the CCC principle. As each regional economy is different, this means tailored solutions. Each country will have different resources and primary energy demands, which will require a portfolio of solutions to enable each industry to account for its local and structural economies. This is also about technology optionality and preventing path dependency. So this means commercializing all options that are available. Science has shown that we cannot take any options off the table, and that includes carbon capture and storage, which also the optionality reduces risk and increases the number of technologies that we have available as we transition. So just quickly, what is carbon capture? Carbon capture and storage is a set of technologies that is able to reduce emissions from industrial facilities, as well as able as a key technology to create hydrogen. The technology is a versatile pollutions control technology that has been working safely storing CO2 for about 50 years. There are more than 20 commercial scale capture facilities operating globally that are capturing around 40 million tons of CO2 annually, which is a far cry away of the 7.6 billion tons needed annually, according to the IEA, in order to meet our emissions reductions goals. CCUS is the only technology of abating emissions from certain industries, which means that it is needed for our energy intensive industries to deliver on our carbon goals. There are many projects in planning that are being enabled globally by government investment, but more will be needed to be done in order to build a carbon management economy. So what is CO2 utilization? CO2 can also be repurposed for other potential applications. There are ways to transform CO2 into fuels, cements, plastics, carbon fiber, and other materials. And whilst these technologies are being trialed, we will also need to make sure that we are capturing CO2 emissions as well. The IEA has told us that 95% of CO2 will also need to be stored. So how much carbon is expected to be needed to meet our carbon reduction goals? So many organizations have highlighted the desperate need to start deploying carbon capture and storage and utilization technologies. It has been firmly highlighted by the United Nations in IPCC in its 1.5 degree report that it will be a necessary technology. The IEA has also said that it will be impossible to reach our climate goals without deployment of carbon capture technologies, which means we need to increase our climate ambition and the need for carbon capture and storage. So how much does it cost to deploy carbon capture and storage is another question that we very often get asked. There are plenty of blueprints for how we've commercialized other clean energy technologies, for example, in the UK and in Denmark, and how Germany have used feed-in tariffs to reduce the cost of renewable energy. So these deployment incentives will reduce the cost, enable learning by doing, and support infrastructure for our next generation of clean energy technologies. The IEA has told us that about 70% of energy-related investment will need to be driven by governments, and hence we will need to rely on governments putting investment and policy frameworks in place in order to deploy this. So this is CATF's map of carbon capture project activity across Europe, which shows about 14 different European countries that have planned carbon capture storage projects. These are being applied for cement, steel, blue hydrogen, waste to energy, as well as a few power stations within the UK. Annual emissions must be cut 25 billion tons by 2030 to meet our 1.5 degree scenario as stated by the UN. So our mapping shows that industry is really starting to step up and embrace the need to deploy a carbon management economy. So the momentum that we're seeing has been kickstarted by an improved policy framework and environment for carbon capture across Europe. So we've seen multi-billion investments from the Dutch and Norwegian government for full chain carbon capture projects, as well as in the UK as part of the UK government's 10-point plan for industrial decarbonisation clusters, as well as dedicated funding towards carbon management. We've also seen recent policy announcements from Sweden, Denmark, and Germany. And then at an EU level, we've seen that in the revised regulation for the 10E, the regulation will now look to include the necessary inclusion of CO2 transport and storage. The Fit for 55 EU emissions trading system is another key piece of policy that's helping to scale up carbon capture activity, as well as the Innovation Fund. And recently the EU held its first EU CCUS forum, which gives a clear signal from EU level that CCUS strategy will be needed with long-term policy roadmaps as part of Europe's decarbonisation goals. So this is a piece of analysis that Clean Air Task Force recently did, looking at, as part of green recovery announcements, which countries have dedicated funding towards carbon capture. So new countries that have recently started putting financing towards this include Croatia, Greece, and Germany. And then moving over to the, moving over to the US now. The US has got about over 40 projects planned across the US, which has been enabled by the 45Q tax incentive, which offers $50 a ton to store CO2, which is now looking at $85 a ton with the recently announced American Jobs Plan. Which also includes 21 billion of funding for CO2 and hydrogen infrastructure, as well as hub creation. Clean Air Task Force is proud to have worked on designing some of these policies, and we're looking forward to their implementation. And then finally, this is the decarbonisation hubs model, which looks at how connecting multiple high-emitting industrial and energy facilities can be used to enable collaboration and the sharing of infrastructure and insights in order to collectively decarbonise emissions. So the coordinated build-out of CO2 transport and storage for industry to decarbonise using the hubs model, but looking now towards what high-level policies will be needed to make these happen. So the hub model helps overcome the challenge of decarbonisation by reducing financial costs and risk, increasing economic efficiency and enabling greater innovation through shared infrastructure, as well as facilities with deep emissions reduction, clustering them in high areas of concentration. And finally, the coordination enables faster uptake since it's more effective to build large infrastructure facilities than multiple small ones. And I think that's everything.
Okay, Olivia, thanks very much. That's a very good overview of the situation with CCUS. Some questions already coming in online, so you've catalyzed some discussion already, but we'll come back to that in a second. I think our next speaker, if I'm not mistaken, is Martin Lambert from the OIES, who is going to talk about hydrogen, well, gaseous fuels and circular carbon. Hydrogen, I know he's going to talk about hydrogen, I know he's going to talk about biogas and biomethane as well. So Martin, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much, and hello everyone. Yeah, indeed. So I'm going to speak today about gaseous fuels, and maybe just to start with, explain the use of that term rather than gas. And that's because gas is often seen by people as being sort of maybe something which is a bad thing because it's a fossil fuel, whereas gaseous fuels is much broader, talking about, so indeed, what to do with fossil gas that we still use, and biomethane, and then low carbon and renewable hydrogen. So that's what I'll be covering. If the clicker works, it does. Here's the one slide summary of what I'm going to be talking about. And the first bullet point may come as a bit of a shock to some, perhaps. No role for unabated natural gas in a net zero world. And so all the words there are important, but if it's net zero, and then any natural gas, which is a fossil fuel, has to be abated. And so it's not such an alarming statement, perhaps, but it's kind of at the heart, perhaps, of the circular economy, that any carbon emitted either needs to have been recently captured from the atmosphere or captured soon afterwards, sucked down to the atmosphere. So hence the remove, recycle concept. Having said that, and I think I agree with most things that Olivia said around CCUS is going to have a vital role. We talked this morning about residual infrastructure, so lots of power stations running on natural gas have a pretty vital role for balancing intermittent renewables, but on a pathway to net zero, CCUS is essential to capture the CO2 that comes from using that natural gas. The next couple of bullet points talk about biomethane. And I think it's important to talk about biomethane because in the last couple of years, with all the focus around hydrogen, biomethane has been a bit in danger of being forgotten about, but it has a pretty important role to play. And as you'll see later, it actually is already playing quite a, well, not a significant role, but actually a more significant role than low carbon hydrogen. And it could play a much bigger role. I'll talk a bit more, but in fact, today, the International Gas Union has just released a report, which I and a small team edited for them, about renewable gases and their role. And so that report, you can find it on the IGU website. So I commend you to go and look for that. And that talks about the role and the scale-up challenge for biomethane and for low-carbon hydrogen. Hydrogen is clearly going to be important, and everyone talks about it. We believe that blue hydrogen, so from natural gas with CCUS, is an important first step, followed by green hydrogen. And that has both economic, because blue is cheaper than green in most cases, and environmental benefits, because in many cases, if you make green hydrogen too early, while your power grid is not decarbonized, you're wasting your renewable power generation, which could be used for decarbonizing the grid. And so your green hydrogen, if you draw the circle correctly, is not very green at all, because indirectly it's made from those fossil fuels. And the final point around all this gaseous stuff, though, is I think it's been said a few times today already, that if you can electrify something, then that's pretty likely to be the preferred way to go. So gaseous fuels have a vital role to play, but electrification will certainly be playing a much bigger role in the future. And cost and scale is the key challenge. So I'll unpack a few of those more in the next few slides. So this is a slide where I've tried to capture a number of concepts also linking with the circular carbon economy. And this is probably sort of the end game of where we want to get to, because you'll see there's no fossil natural gas on this slide, but it's where gas or gaseous fuels are used for what the European Union in particular likes to talk about as sector integration. So it's kind of how the energy system fits together with gas in the middle. So picking out a few highlights from it, particularly relevant to the circular carbon economy. So at the top, you start from renewable electricity, which could be wind, could be solar, but could also be biomass. So again, carbon recently sucked out of the atmosphere. You make hydrogen via electrolysis, and that could be used directly for transport or industry, for example, or it could at some level be blended into a natural gas grid. And another interesting use of hydrogen in the context of the circular carbon economy is, so I talked about biomethane. So start from biogas, and then the biogas is a mixture of carbon dioxide and methane. To make even more low carbon methane, you can react the hydrogen with that bio carbon dioxide and make additional biomethane to go into the gas grid. If you then got some of your legacy power plants with CCS, even then get to the point we could have negative emissions ultimately by putting that CO2, which is of biogenic origin, then into CO2 storage. So that's kind of the end game, but there's a long way to go until you get to that point. This is some hot off the press data from the European Network of Transmission System Operators, looking at their scenarios out to 2050 of what happens to gaseous fuels. And on the top left chart, you can see a few things happening. You can see that unabated methane, so the grey bits, both domestic and imported, they decline a bit between now and 2030, but accelerate pretty rapidly thereafter under pretty much any of the scenarios you care to look at. Biomethane, on the other hand, the green bit, and then the pale green and blue bits for synthetic and imported methane. So green methane still has quite a role to play. And I said previously on a slide that globally about 20% of current gas demand could be met by biomethane. Within Europe, being a smaller land area, maybe more like around 10 to 15%. So it's not replacing the gas industry, but it could be significant. And then on the hydrogen side, projections of rapid growth in hydrogen. But really the thing I want to highlight on this slide, and again, in discussion on hydrogen, it's sometimes forgotten about, is that there's a lot of hydrogen already in use today. And so on that bottom right chart, the left-hand bar shows current use of hydrogen. Now that's almost entirely grey hydrogen. And then if you look at the rate of growth of low carbon hydrogen on the bars to the right, you can see that between now and 2030, effectively all we need to do is to decarbonize the existing industrial use of hydrogen. So in refineries, making fertilizer, petrochemicals, those kind of things. So new uses of hydrogen are kind of interesting, but really the important thing is let's stop emitting carbon from current use of hydrogen. And that already will be a good way to start this scale-up journey for hydrogen. I talked about how cost and scale remain key challenges for any sort of renewable or low carbon gas. And the top left chart illustrates that fairly well, I think, by covering the whole range of gaseous fuels. The natural gas range on there is my sort of assumption of long-term natural gas range. Prices recently, as many are aware, have been rather higher than that. So up to probably around the blue hydrogen level on the right-hand side there. But in the long term, our assumption is natural gas will go back to being that sort of level. So you can see that any kind of low carbon gas is more expensive than natural gas. But then that, which is why government incentives are required to make this happen. It also makes the point that biomethane, as well as being available and good for the environment, is also likely to be in many cases lower cost than the forms of hydrogen. Also the point, green hydrogen is currently a lot more expensive than blue hydrogen. So starting with blue hydrogen definitely makes economic sense. Green hydrogen costs are driven by the cost of renewable power generation and the cost of electrolyzers. Hopefully both of those will come down, but the timing of that decline. So directionally, I think it's sure to come down. The speed of that decline, I think the jury's out on how fast it will come down. The bottom right chart is a key one, I think. So from that report I mentioned that we did with the International Gas Union. And so to put it in context, looking at global primary energy today, natural gas is about 25% of global primary energy. That chart shows that biomethane currently is about 0.25%, so 1% of current natural gas demand. But bear in mind, sustainable potential could be 20 times that. But we need to get motoring on scaling up that biomethane production. And then, despite all the excitement around low carbon and renewable hydrogen, those little bars on the right-hand side of that bottom right chart is where production of low carbon hydrogen is today. So there's a hugely long way to go to get it to move the needle on decarbonising the energy system. And so that current European hydrogen production that I mentioned, we need 100 gigawatts of electrolyzer capacity. And currently in Europe, the largest project being even not yet at FID, but approaching FID, is around 100 megawatts. So that scale challenge for hydrogen is going to be huge. So finally, coming back to sort of put it all together and the way forward and thinking back to the circular carbon economy, we need to pursue all those decarbonisation options at speed. CCUS will be important to reduce carbon emissions from natural gas and from making current hydrogen. So that's part of the circular carbon economy. Scaling up biomethane, as long as it's sustainable, that's another way of the circular carbon economy. Renewable power generation to decarbonize the power grid. And then after that, moving on to green hydrogen, that's going to be important. So again, just to emphasize, first priority, decarbonize existing hydrogen production. After that, large-scale industrial applications, so like steel, and an area I think with hydrogen often forgotten about is an important storage medium. So we need to get working on developing salt caverns and maybe other technologies, but salt caverns in particular, to store that hydrogen for the long term. But in order for any of that to happen at scale, it requires governments to step up, not on their own, because industry needs to work with them, but industry and governments and financiers all need to work together to develop a clear policy framework and business models. And at the Institute, we hope to be looking at that a lot more, so the whole business model focus in looking at hydrogen over the next few years. That's what we really want to focus on, is how to make this into a long-term sustainable business. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Martin. That was great. And again, questions are coming in, so that's good to catalyse those. We have one more speaker, Fateh Balad, who's here with us now, and I think has some slides to show, or not have some slides to show?
I do have some slides to share.
Some slides which are going to appear, I hope, very shortly. And then we will go to our two discussants after that. Here come the slides, excellent. So in the room, if you've got some comments to make, please do use your name tags to do that. So Fateh, over to you.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. So in this brief presentation, I will discuss a crucial topic that has been identified as one of the prominent solutions to achieve the carbon neutrality goals and shape the CCE framework. So, which is the energy efficiency. Specifically, I will discuss the topic from 3 dimensions. So I will discuss why it's important to focus on energy efficiency while shaping the energy transition and sustainability path. Second, what are the barriers that stand in the way of large-scale deployment of energy efficiency? And finally, I will provide some recommendation to speed up the energy efficiency implementation process. So before delving into the topic, first of all, let me give a brief definition of energy efficiency. So a straight definition of energy efficiency is the use of technology to achieve the same level of services measured as economic output or production quantity while consuming less energy. And typically energy efficiency is considered in the end-use sector like buildings, agriculture, and transportation. And actually energy efficiency is the first fuel, the fuel we don't need to have to use, and in terms of supply is abundantly available and cheap to extract. So to the first dimension of my talk today, why it's important to focus on energy efficiency while shaping the energy transition and sustainability path. Major global challenges is that both world population and energy consumption are increasing steadily, the world population almost doubled within 50 years. And by 2050, the population is projected to increase to 10 billion, and more than 2/3 of the world population will live in the urban area. Global energy consumption is expected to rise by 27% by 2040, which underscores serious challenges for mitigating climate change. So this intensive urbanization and energy use already presents serious challenges to our society, including environmental quality degradation, increasing socioeconomic inequalities, and energy insecurity. And under this context, the global energy sector is undergoing a rapidly acceleration transition, and this tackling climate change is one of the critical consideration among these objectives, but governments actually are faced with other priorities, including ensuring affordable energy supply, reinforcing energy security, and delivering universal energy access to everyone. As I mentioned, one of the key energy policies to achieve the Paris Agreement and the CC framework is energy efficiency deployment. So energy efficiency improvement has the potential to mitigate tensions between economic growth objectives and sustainable development commitments. So according to International Energy Agency, energy efficiency improvement could deliver over 1/3 of the cumulative reduction of greenhouse gas emission necessary to stabilize climate change. Actually, energy efficiency have massive potential to deliver cost-effective greenhouse gas emission in different sectors. One of the promising sector actually is the building, and according to the International Energy Agency, about 80% of the economic potential of energy efficiency in building is not realized, and 20 to 30% of this energy efficiency potential can be achieved without any technical issue. So for example, if we look at building sector, energy efficiency deployment in building has the potential to knock 2 or more birds down with one stone by fostering a healthier environment and improving well-being and contributing to the several development goals, including the SDG 3, SDG 7, for example, and SDG 8. So on the third dimension of my presentation regarding the energy efficiency deployment barriers, so despite considerable promise of energy efficiency and the multiple benefits that energy efficiency can offer to both developed and developing countries, there are many barriers that stand in the way of large-scale deployment of energy efficiency in different sectors. So this points to the so-called energy efficiency paradox, sometimes referred as the energy efficiency gap, broadly defined as a significant and persistent difference between the socially optimal levels of investment in energy efficiency. And this phenomenon is linked to the fact that individuals seem to underinvest in energy efficiency improvement that have the potential to be more than worthwhile in terms of energy saving. So energy efficiency paradox is not a new subject. Several explanations can be brought forward to understand the energy efficiency paradox, which can be summarized into 3 or 4 barriers, starting from the classical economic perspective to the behavioral economics perspective. So the investment cost, the hidden cost, and the split intensive and other market failure, and endurance inertia and lack of interest. So the split intensive actually are one of the most discussed barriers to energy efficiency improvement. We can distinguish two markets. In the first market, we suppose that individuals in for example, in the building sector, how their buildings are poorly insulated, for example, and in the advantage of energy efficiency benefits. And in the second market, it's it's very similar to the Akerlof model actually regarding with the so-called market of limits. In this case, people actually or individuals know that there is different product in the market with different energy efficiency levers, but they don't have the information to get this information. So these people, maybe they will leave the market. So delivering energy efficiency require addressing these barriers. And if policies can address these barriers, there is good prospect for net economic and environmental gain. So there is three main type of policies, which are economic incentives, information strategies, and energy efficiency standards. So for lack of time, I will stop here. I will be happy to ask your questions. Thank you.
Okay, Faisal, thanks very much. And I think it's interesting, the comparison here with the potential gains from solving the methane emissions problem as well, and what barriers there are to that too, but we'll come to that later. Okay, so we've got a couple of discussants now just to get this kind of discussion and the Q&A going. Rami Shabane, let me turn to you first for some quick thoughts, if I may.
Right, thank you, James, and thanks for all the speakers for their insightful presentations. The speakers have already identified some of the key technologies we need to get to net zero. And I'll reiterate again that we need all of these to get there. But of course, it doesn't come with without any challenges. You need the support mechanism to get there. So you would need to identify the financial and regulatory framework to enable these technologies, because many of these technologies are not in the commercial state yet. Some of the speakers have identified. When we launched the CCE last year, we've worked with the OECD in publishing a paper on the enabling policies, which is the theme of this session. And it was separated. The enabling mechanisms were separated between the overarching common enablers that cross across the 4 Rs, and then there's the specific enablers that each R or each technology would require. So those common enabling themes, those include like long-term decarbonization plans and targets, which are needed as prerequisites. And we've seen a lot in the last couple of weeks here at the COP. Many nations have announced their net zero plans, but of course those need to be complemented with carbon pricing and removing other inefficiencies in the energy system. Of course, another common enabler is the international cooperation, which is needed, and that ranges from putting forth international standards for key technologies, as well as facilitating cross-border trade of low carbon goods, and this could be done, in a corporate partnership or from government to government, and we've seen both happening. And of course, another enabling policy could be the ensuring realignment and meeting social objectives, creating jobs, improving air quality, things like that. That could be intertwined with the climate policies. And then lastly was the strong innovation framework, which includes the R&D funding towards these technologies, because I think the IEA released a report, was it the Clean Energy Innovation Report, and showed some discrepancies, in terms of where the R&D are being allocated in these technologies. I think there was about $17 billion allocated for applied research on low carbon technologies. Around 3/4 of those were spent on renewable energy and energy efficiency. And only 1/4 was distributed between the technologies like CCS, CCUS, hydrogen, bioenergy, and battery storage. But that last quarter those technologies are what you need for the hard to abate sectors, which 25% of the emissions are coming from your long haul transportation, cement, steel. So it's how do you kind of shift the funding from renewable energy efficiency is important, and we've seen how that kind of paid off. That funding have paid off in the investments that we see on the ground. But now it's how do you kind of reallocate some of that to these hard to abate sectors. Which gets me to the specific supportive policies that we need. What do we need to de-risk those investments? Because a lot of these new technologies like hydrogen and CCUS are very complex. They have very complex business model. With renewable energy, it's easy. You have your wind farm, you connect it to the grid and you're done. With green hydrogen, you need to get your electrolyzer. You need to talk to a renewable energy developer, get electricity. You need to talk to a water provider, secure some water. And then that's just from the production side. And then if your electricity is intermittent, then you need to figure out how you're going to get the electricity from the grid, or you have to do agreements on that as well. And then from the other side, you have to take offtake agreements. So similarly with CCUS, I mean, it's not just one technology. There's a range of technologies with CCUS, and you can recycle, you can reuse the carbon, you can remove it. So there's different ways that you can do it. So a lot of the value chain integration needs to happen for that to have a suitable model for investors to kind of say, okay, this will give me a steady revenue in the long term. So I'll stop here, but these are kind of the issues that I want to put on the table. What are the specific policies for each of these technologies that can help uptake the scale up of these technologies? Yeah.
Rami, thank you very much. So some interesting issues that you've raised there, and we'll get into those certainly in the Q&A. So finally, thank you for your patience, Joseph. We have Joseph Seckley from EPRI, who's sitting online, waiting to offer us some thoughts and perhaps raise some issues as well. Joseph, what have you got to say?
Sure. Thanks for having me here. I feel like a lot of the stuff that's been said could have been from material that EPRI would have put together as well. So I think there's a lot of agreement between what the early panelists and early discussers and Rami, the latest panelist, said. I think one of the things that Rami mentioned there that I would highlight is the need to take a value chain approach as we're bringing a lot of these new technologies and a lot of these new options to the market. In this deep decarbonization transformation that we're really beginning to talk about now, it's a bit different from the earlier steps like energy efficiency and deployment of renewable energy that we've taken before, where you're now having to bring both supply and demand technologies to the market at one time. And so I think that, as Olivia highlighted, things like hub approaches or just more general approaches to incentives that ensure that you're not just incentivizing supply or demand, because you're going to need to bring both. And if you just incentivize one or the other, you're going to be setting yourself up for failure. So really taking that value chain approach. Olivia also mentioned optionality. I think that's something that's core that we think about and needs to be thought about in terms of there are a wide and disparate amount of resource availability for whatever resource you want to talk about that's clean across the globe and even across smaller geographies. And so ensuring that we set incentives and policies that focus on the carbon reduction itself and not the specific technology or approach that's taken to achieve that carbon reduction is going to be key if we want to do this in the rapid fashion that we do need to make deep decarbonization happen. And then I believe Rami also mentioned economic justice, and that's something that has been, a clear focus here in the United States, is I think something that's critically important if we're going to drive adoption of these technologies. When you look at earlier technologies that have come along, there's a lot of reasons why it may have happened this way, but one of the criticisms that has occurred and has probably slowed down some of the adoption is that the benefits to deployment of newer, cleaner technologies have not been dispersed amongst everyone in the community equally. It's gone to those that in a lot of cases could either afford to pay or just had better access. And so we need to ensure, if we're going to get rapid adoption and get achieve the targets that we want to achieve, that we make sure that everyone is receiving the benefits across as we decarbonize, and it's not just accrued by a few at the beginning, because I think that will ultimately challenge the deployment of these technologies.
Okay, thank you. That was a very useful intervention. We've got, well, I might run over a little bit because we've got closing comments. We've got about 20 minutes, I guess, for Q&A. One question that's come in a couple of times in the previous sessions and again now is around the infrastructure requirements. And if we're going to do this fast, are we not going to have to use existing infrastructure? So Martin, can I come to you first and talk about the infrastructure requirements for both biogas and hydrogen and how we might optimize the use of the existing system? And then Olivia, I'll come to you on CO2 if I may.
Sure. Yes. So for biomethane, it's kind of easy because it's entirely fungible with natural gas. So you can just stick it in the same infrastructure, you can turn it into LNG, and if you wanted to, and that's easy. Hydrogen is obviously a lot more challenging. And I think the jury is still out on how the infrastructure will work for that. There was at one point, so the UK as an example, a study of looking at converting the gas distribution grid to hydrogen. I think the recent UK government heat and building strategy has kind of kicked that into the long grass. I mean, it could come back in 2026, but for now the focus is on electrification and building heat. But I think the big question of infrastructure for hydrogen, I think, which I touched on in the presentation, worth re-highlighting, is around storage. Because one of the drivers for why we want to have gaseous fuels rather than just electrification is for long-term storage. But storing hydrogen is far from trivial. And so I think to figure out maybe it's repurposing some natural gas infrastructure for storage, but I think that needs to be looked at as a matter of urgency. Pipeline conversions, so transmission pipelines for hydrogen is doable and has been done in some cases, but more work to do on that as well. So yeah, definitely a big question.
Okay, thanks. And Olivia, to you, I mean, obviously the question around transporting and storing CO2 is obviously critical to this whole thing as well. So could you talk a little bit about that and about how that might fit with existing infrastructure as well as new infrastructure?
Yeah, so this is a key thing that CATF has been working on at a EU policy level with the 10E regulation and the need to complete the framework by the inclusion of different modalities for transport, as well as the inclusion of storage in the regulation. So retrofitting what we already have in industrialized economies is going to be really important, but this will need dedicated CO2 transport networks and also storage for those countries that don't otherwise have ways to sequester their carbon. So that is by both shipping routes as well as dedicated pipeline infrastructure. And this is also a way to safeguard existing assets by retrofitting and repurposing the assets that we already have.
Okay, thanks. There's a question on financing as well. This is still CCS. And Olivia, I'm going to start with you, and then I'm going to come to Martin, if I may, afterwards. The question is about the balance between public and private funding and whether companies, oil and gas companies particularly, ought to be just getting on with it. The questioner makes a rather ironic comment. They've got plenty of cash this year, so why don't they just get on and do it? But I guess the question for you is what balance do you see between public and private financing for CCUS?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's not currently economic to deploy CCS. And whilst there are incentives like the EU ETS, carbon pricing is not going to be enough alone to crowd in investment. With the 45Q in the US, you have a predetermined carbon value as well as government signaling long-term policy commitment to this. And what the CATF mapping has shown is direct correlation between government support for carbon management and project activity, which what the industry is now having is demonstration mode, but we need the long-term policy roadmaps and the business models to turn those demonstration projects into wide-scale asset transformation. And I agree with the comment, the financing is there. It's just a matter of getting the business models and the policy commitments right to crowd that in.
Thank you. Martin, I mean, there is a big play made about how blue hydrogen has to come first and green hydrogen, will be the longer term option, but blue hydrogen does rely on CCS technology, and yet we're not seeing very much of it. So how do we join the dots there?
Well, I certainly agree with Olivia that there's no business case for investing in CCS at the moment without government support. So that's, I think, the important point to bear in mind, that governments need to, private players need to work with governments to figure out a way to make the business model sustainable. And that can happen in different ways. I think there's some good examples now emerging. So and use some European examples. So Northern Lights in Norway has been partly funded by 3 private players, Shell, Equinor and Total, but 2/3 funded by the Norwegian government. So basically direct input of cash into the project. In the Netherlands, and perhaps for the most exciting example to date, is a carbon contract for difference, where the developer has been promised a carbon price, and so the government contributes there, but that's a sustainable business model and could be repeated. The UK is kind of having a consultation currently on how the business model might work, and that's still in progress, as I understand it, but that could end up being similar, perhaps, to the Dutch model. But one other important point around public versus private is then a liability question, and that's where CCS is quite unique, I think. There's questions around, once the CO2 is in the ground, hopefully it will stay there long term. But in the low probability but high impact event it was a leak, who's liable for that? And if the corporate entities put it down there, but it leaks in 100 years' time, there's no guarantee the corporate entities will still be there. So how's that going to be managed? So I think there's still quite a lot of complex issues to be arranged around making CCS implementable at commercial scale, but it does need worked on quickly because the scale of the challenge is huge.
Great, thank you. Anyone in the room who's got any comments, please just flick your name tags. Jonathan, I'm going to come to you in a minute. No, not now, in a minute on methane emissions, but Fateh, can I start with you? You talked about the opportunities in energy efficiency, but a lot of the focus, certainly this morning, has been on pace and the need to get things done, not just by 2050, but by 2030. So where's the low-hanging fruit in energy efficiency? What are the things we can do quickly to make a difference in the next 10 years?
Yeah, it's a very difficult question to answer, James. Thank you very much. And it's a very interesting question. As I say, there is different policy, to speed up the energy efficiency uptake, including economic incentives and information strategies and energy efficiency standards. Actually, energy efficiency choices require investment, this very complex investment decision-making, including trading of cost to now or future saving. I think the most important actually policy to put in place to speed up the uptake of energy efficiency, maybe the behavioral change and some incentives, mainly for vulnerable people, to help them to renovate, for example, their houses and refurbish their energy system and so on. And I think that's actually individual wants to minimize private costs and society wants to minimize the social costs, and we have to, and depending, if the problem is unpriced externality, so the efficient policy response is tax on energy and to reduce the use of equipment as well as encourage purchase of efficient equipment. But this tax maybe increase the energy prices for vulnerable people. So we'll have to be very careful regarding this strategy. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Jonathan, I want to come to you on a sort of slightly related issue, which is this question around the incentive to get people to do something. The IEA analysis would suggest that a lot of the solution around methane emissions is actually negative, cost. So why are people not doing it now? What's the catalyst to get that level of efficiency back into the system?
I mean, I think a part of the answer to this is very, very poor information and data. I mean, if you try and get decent data on methane emissions and actually also CO2 emissions from flaring, you've got really two data sets, the UNFCCC, which is very, very difficult to work with, and the IEA methane tracker, which is also difficult to work with, but the IEA guys are a little bit more accessible, so you can quiz them about what they've done, what they know, what they don't know, and that's been really good. But so many of the things we've been talking about in this session, I was asked actually a question because I do a podcast, something I don't much like doing, which is what's really new in the last 10 years? I mean, should we say there are people around this table who, like me, are, shall we say, not at the beginning of their careers, and therefore we've been around for a long time talking about these issues. Well, what are we talking about now that we weren't talking about 10 years ago? Are we talking about energy efficiency 10 years ago? Have we made big strides? Well, maybe not. We were talking about carbon capture and storage. Have we made big strides? No, we weren't so much talking about hydrogen. But these are, I think, really difficult things. The difference in something like methane emissions and CO2 emissions from oil and gas is these are easy issues. These are things that don't cost, as you say, they probably have negative cost. And the reason they're not happening is a lot of countries are in denial about them. A lot of countries actually deny that they're emitting anything. And what we're doing is we're seeing things from satellites. Not that satellites see everything. We're seeing them from satellites where you've got to explain this. You know, if you're telling us that this is not you, tell us what we're seeing here in your country next to what we think is your oil and gas facilities. And unfortunately, we've got to actually call countries and companies out on this. It's not a nice thing to do. People don't like it. You can create conflicts. You can irritate people. But if we're going to solve it, we've got to do it. And the really tricky thing is that once you start to embarrass people, they get defensive. And once they get defensive, then you're into possible litigation, all sorts of things. So I guess that's not a very satisfactory answer. But if we can't do easy things, are we really going to be able to do difficult things?
Okay, that was a slightly more depressing answer than I was expecting, but anyway. Joseph, I'd like to come to you actually, talking about incentives. I mean, you talked about the kind of value chain approach and we're talking about how to get people to act here. One solution, which of course is a major topic for COP26, is carbon markets, potential carbon taxes. What do you think about that? And is that the key to unlocking all this kind of value chain approach, do you think, to solving the issues?
I'd say it's an approach. I mean, I have a U.S. bias given where I'm located here, and we do have some carbon markets that have risen up and do take place in the U.S., but it's also something that is a conversation that's been had for at least 2 decades now with very little progress. So I think it certainly could be a solution, but it's more of a stick approach. And I think at least in the US, and I think you could say internationally as well, the carrot approach, at least thus far, has worked more effectively than some of the stick approach. And so offering things like incentives like the 45Q tax credit that was highlighted earlier. In the US, we have an investment tax credit for solar and a production tax credit for wind. And you've certainly seen feed-in tariffs and other things internationally as well. And those are things that they may not be the best approach if you want to say ideally from an economic solution. That's what I draw up. But they have been a solution that has been politically palatable and something that has moved these technologies forward.
Okay, thanks. That leads very nicely into my next question, actually, which is a questioner from online has said that there's several financial incentive packages in Europe and the US, which you just mentioned, but what about incentivizing developing economies around CCUS? Olivia, what do you think about incentives for developing economies?
So international organizations such as the World Bank have dedicated CCUS funding to support with development and deployment of CCUS activity in developing countries. But I think as well, what is going to be so crucial is raising the profile of the technology and its capabilities to help countries industrialize whilst also doing that in a way that helps meet climate goals. And that's about sharing key lessons, key learnings, and international best practices. And also for countries that do have storage capacity, providing developing countries with the opportunity to sequester their CO2 in areas where the facilities exist.
Okay, thanks very much indeed. Anupama, you've got your name tag turned, so what do you like to say?
Yeah, I suppose I just had a question around the issue of business models as a barrier to the deployment of CCUS. And I suppose I'm sort of confused as to what the barrier is there. So for instance, we said that governments need to provide incentives. Martin, you gave us the example of a carbon CFD, which could be successful, could be replicable. But that's essentially a revenue stabilization mechanism, and it's worked quite well for the deployment of renewable electricity. So I don't see any reason why, if revenue stabilization is enough of an incentive for deployment, why that can't then be replicated by other governments. But is the issue here one of profitability? And then are we talking about an industry that's used to a high risk, high reward sort of business? And we're talking about a completely different sort of business model. So I suppose my question to any of the speakers and panelists is, what's the barrier there in terms of the business model?
Interesting. Martin, I'll turn to you first. Are companies just expecting to make too much money, basically?
I mean, I think the CFD model is one that has a lot of mileage. It's worked well for getting renewable power generation off the ground. I think the issue for CCS is it's a more complex beast because I think for renewable power, there's a process went through feed-in tariffs first of all, and people thought, they're a bit too expensive, we're actually wasting money there. Let's move to the CFD approach, we have auctions, and that kind of works better. I think, though, as I mentioned with CCUS, because you've got that whole liability question around the storage, you've got complexity around if you build a pipeline system to transport CO2, is that then under a third-party access regime, or is it a private infrastructure? So regulatory questions around that. So I think there's more complexity around CCUS than there is around renewable power generation. Just another thought I had was around in terms of, because kind of who pays was a key question. And the question on developing countries struck me that carbon pricing is clearly a key thing to drive the right behavior. I mean, in an ideal world, there'd be a global carbon price, and that would drive the right, from an economics 101 point of view, that would be great. From an equity point of view, it'd probably be less great, because then people may not be able to afford to pay that. But maybe something like the EU Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism may be a way for rich countries with a carbon border adjustment mechanism to transfer funding to developing countries who need help to lower their carbon footprint. So just a view, but no easy answers, which is why people are still working on it.
Thank you. Joseph, let me come to you as well, if I may. You talked about the complexity of the business models, and you also talked about reducing risk. And I guess that there's two ways of addressing this. One, you've got to either guarantee a high return, or else you can reduce the risk and lower the return expectations. I mean, what are your thoughts around reducing risk?
I mean, I think reducing risk is something that can be done in a number of ways, but one of the ways that we're focused on is obviously on technology development and deployment. I think that's something that you're seeing with even the latest infrastructure bill that was just passed here in the United States, with a lot of incentives for early commercial deployment that the government is going to provide to frankly prove out some of these earlier stage technologies so that they are de-risked. And we have things in the US like the loan guarantee program as well, which is explicitly designed to de-risk early stage technologies so that then the private sector can take them on. And so I think that the de-risking piece, especially through government incentives or things like low-cost loans, is key to really getting early, in number 1, 2, and 3 iterations of the technology out in the market, so that then private sector does feel comfortable enough to pick it up.
Thank you, Rami. You mentioned R&D funding, I think, during your comments. And what are your thoughts around this, the whole way of incentivizing the business model to work?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, a lot of the R&D is kind of focused right now, obviously, renewable energy and energy efficiency. It makes sense. I mean, these are known as the low-hanging fruits. But in terms of your question about, what do we need to de-risk? And I think, from a hydrogen perspective, because I was looking at it more often, is the long-term offtake agreements. Those are really important, I think, because right now there is no market for, say, hydrogen. There's no market even for CO2. So I think these long-term agreements are important. However, we always compared hydrogen with the LNG business or an offshore wind business. In the past, you would have to sign a long-term PPA if you're an offshore wind to a grid, or if you're in LNG, you have to pre-sell your gas before building the actual plant. That's important as well. But in hydrogen, for example, the difference is that the receiving party who wants that hydrogen doesn't have the infrastructure in the first place. LNG was more of a, you could say, a logistical thing. I'm getting you the gas. You already have the existing gas infrastructure. You already have the turbines. I'm just getting you another source of supply. With hydrogen, we're starting all from scratch. We don't have the turbines. We don't have the pipelines, whether it's in the producing country or the receiving country. So that requires, to de-risk, you need those long-term offtake agreements, and then you need that infrastructure to support those fuels.
Okay, thank you. Adam, you've got your name tag up, so.
Just a quick comment on business case for CCS. It's pointing out the obvious, but the one kind of existing business case is enhanced oil recovery, which is not, it's creating more oil, but in theory that works. Rami just talked about offtake agreements. What you really need is customers for low carbon hydrocarbons. And one of the things, James, you mentioned earlier today that perhaps one of the big successes of COP26 is going to be the methane agreement. Another one could be Article 6 and the possibility of opening up sort of voluntary trading arrangements that would allow low carbon hydrocarbons to thrive. Back to you.
Okay, thanks, Adam. Okay, I mean, I guess one final question on CCS then, Olivia, to you is Article 6 and is the opportunity for trading. I mean, you sort of mentioned the opportunity for kind of storing in various parts of the world. I mean, is Article 6 critical, do you think, to the future of CCS?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this is about really just elevating the fact that from this technology from its historical roots and enabling its potential for use in today's economies as a decarbonization technology. And really what we'd like to see is people getting behind that, people deploying that, governments committing to a strategy behind that, so that we can create partnerships and with both the public and private sector, as well as across borders to sequester CO2.
Okay, thank you. Well, look, we've actually, again, it's gone slightly over our time because the discussion's been really interesting. So thank you again to all our speakers and presenters, and thanks everyone for their questions. We're going to have a few concluding remarks from the World Energy Council and from KAPSARC. So Paul, I'm going to come to you if I may, and ask you for a few comments on what you've heard, and if you like, some conclusions that you've reached.
Well, thank you, James. And it's going to be impossible to sum all of that up in a couple of minutes. First thing I need to do is thank you, James, for excellent moderation. I think it's been a great conversation. I've certainly learned a lot. I think everyone who's online and in the room probably goes away with better understanding. And that takes me back to one of the things that Chris, my colleague Chris, mentioned right up front, the need for improved literacy around energy. And there's a long way still to go, I think, in educating people around some of the issues we've talked about today. We've done a great job with the conversation here in this event. I think we all need to think about how do we take that understanding beyond this room, beyond this webinar, to help policymakers, finance sector, and indeed the public at large understand some of the issues we've been talking about, because without that understanding, we're not going to make a great deal of progress. I think we've all agreed, no silver bullets. We need to explore all the options and try and get to some options that are really scalable very soon. There is a sense of urgency, and we're going to need to ramp up some options in the very near future. That is going to leave us with a whole lot of complex choices, as I've said. So that understanding is crucial, that we find a way of working our way through all of this complexity. One thing that's going to help us through that complexity is metrics. We've had a great discussion around the metrics for CCE. There's more work to be done on how we measure things. And I think very importantly, agreeing standards. There's still some room for tighter definitions and agreeing standards about how we talk about some of the CCE issues. So finally, I think we've still got a lot still to do. There's technology to be improved, there's business models to be worked out, policy frameworks to be worked out, metrics to be improved. So plenty more room for these kind of conversations. I'm just delighted that WEC have been able to co-host this together with KAPSARC and OIAS, and look forward to many more future conversations. Thank you, James.
Thanks very much, Paul. That's great. And the last word indeed goes to KAPSARC. And Adam, I think you've got a few final comments to make.
Sure. Well, let me just see if I can't do a really quick summary of what we accomplished today. The first session introduced the concept of the circular carbon economy, which really is just a shorthand way of saying there's more than one pathway to net zero, and all options scenarios generally tend to be less expensive and accomplish more than single pathways. The second session explored two indices that are meant to help measure progress on climate, KAPSARC's CCE Index, and the World Energy Council's Trilemma Index that focuses on sustainability, security, and affordability. The final session looked at several of the specific technologies that could deliver greenhouse gas management results, including financial and regulatory frameworks that would enable implementation of those technologies. And I wanted to give a shout out to Olivia and the Clean Air Task Force for focusing on CO2 and hydrogen hubs. I think to Paul's comment about scalability, that the idea of hubs, Jubail, which is north of Aramco's facilities in Dhahran in Saudi Arabia, Jubail, the industrial city, is an opportunity for a hub, and I think you'll hear more about that. Houston, Singapore, Rotterdam, I think that this is a way that we might actually accomplish some of that scalability that people have been looking for. I'd like to just mention a few people that couldn't be here today, but were tremendously supportive of today's workshop. Fahad Al-Ajlan, the president of KAPSARC, Angela Wilkinson at the World Energy Council, and Bassam Fatou, of course, at Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. We've had great encouragement to move on these ideas from the leaders of the three organizations, and it's deeply appreciated, I think, by everybody here at the table today. And final comment, let me just echo what Paul said. James, your moderating was fantastic. And if I stop speaking, we'll still have 3 minutes left before the deadline. So thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Adam, for that. And on that positive note, thanks very much to everyone in the room for their contributions. Thanks to everyone online for sticking with us for the last 3 or 4 hours. I've thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. I hope you have too. And I look forward to many more to come, and exactly the learning experience that Paul has outlined. So thanks to all. Stay healthy, everyone, and goodbye.